Chapter 404. Just as Tia entered the graveyard, Brando's party entered the outer region of the loop of trade winds. The disappearance of Vahina and the others was just a small interlude to him. Even though Tia was among the missing, the wild elf was a card creature. Brando could always reset the Mercenaries of Lopez card and summon her to his side. From the very beginning, Brando had no intention of going back to search for her. However, his decision to go deeper into the loop of trade winds was strongly opposed by Erwin's party. Count Audine sternly demanded that he return to search for her. Indeed, if Brando was a real Erwin, he would have considered the consequences of the disappearance of Duke Cruz's daughter. Unfortunately, Brando's way of thinking was influenced by Sophie's modern personality. So what if they were Cruz's people? Even Veronica might not be able to protect herself from the calamity of wolves, not to mention the fact that they were heading back the same way they came from. If it was for his companions, Brando might have fought to the death, but for a few strangers, it was not worth it. What's more, those Carlutzian nobles had schemed against him before. Brendel did not think he was a villain, but he was also not a modest gentleman who repaid evil with good. As for what the Erwin's party thought, Brando once again used his actions to show them that he did not care about the opinions of these people who used the banner of the royal faction. Brando was still sneering in his heart. These people always used the name of the kingdom to talk about things. When he was impatient, he would use the silver brooch of the Royal Knights Order to scare them to death. Most of the insignia of the Royal Knights Order were made of brass. Only the captains were given a silver brooch, while the commanders was gilded. In fact, captains were at least close attendants of the royal family. Compared to their relationship with the royal family, they were much closer than the people in the royal faction. Of course, Brendel knew that it was just a thought. Even though Princess Griffine had secretly given him the brooch, Brendel knew that she might not be willing to reveal her relationship with him. If he used the brooch to intimidate others, he was afraid that he would leave a bad impression on the future princess regent. With Brando's current strength, he did not care about the impression he would leave in the princess's mind. However, he did not want that to happen. So he decided to ignore the nobles. He knew that they would not dare to leave his party. The 20+ of them wandering around in the Black Forest was just like delivering food to the monsters. The calamity of wolves was not the only monster in the Black Forest. As he expected. Although Brando did not agree with Count Audine's position, he was still clear-headed. Seeing the young man's stubbornness, he did not turn back like Dolent did. Instead, he shamelessly followed them. He knew that if he chose to turn back, it was very likely that his party would never be able to return. Brendel looked back at the Awin's envoys from afar, and a mysterious smile appeared on his face. He raised his head again, and his gaze passed through the darkness of the night, quietly gazing at the undulating shadows of the mountains in the distance. In that direction, the Thorn Ridge formed a wide range of hills to the south and east of the Wall of Roses. Once they crossed the hills, they would enter the Kalanga Mountain Range's northern branch. Brando had already forgotten the name of the branch, but even if it was the Thorn Ridge area, it was still considered the periphery of the loop of trade winds. In fact, when he looked around, he could already see a thin layer of white gauze-like fog in the dark forest. This was under the condition that the wall of clouds of the loop of trade winds had opened up a path in the clouds. If it was any other day, this place would already be covered in fog. Whether it was in the southeast or the southwest, they could see the towering wall of clouds. The dark clouds even covered the stars. Because it was so high, when people looked up, they would have the illusion that the clouds on both sides were curved toward the center. Being in this path of clouds, people would suddenly have the illusion that they were contained in it, and they would immediately have the illusion that they were small and contained in it. Even if it was just a casual glance, it was enough to shock him. Brando took a deep breath. He saw the blue light flowing above the canopy of the dark forest. It was the purest magic power, unaffected by any kind of power. However, this magic power quickly sank into the barbarian land and turned black. Then, it formed into monsters in the forest. The tide of magic had come, and the air seemed to be filled with such a smell. A silver moon shone on the mountains and the dense forest. But then he was slightly startled. The green light in his vision changed and formed a line of small words that was projected infinitely far away. Mercenaries of Lopez, Tia has entered the graveyard. Brando was surprised. He immediately stopped and contacted the wild elf girl. To be honest, it was not unexpected that she met with trouble in the dark forest. However, he was still surprised that it happened so quickly. After all, Tia was a silver-ranked elementalist. Even if she met with a small wolf pack, she would at least have the ability to escape. Unless she met with a male wolf. Could it be that there was a third wolf pack in this area? This made Brando a little cautious. He first comforted the little girl. Was funny. This was the second time the little girl had entered the graveyard alone. He did not know why this cute little girl was always so unlucky. Could it be because the lucky girl took all her luck? Dia was stronger than he had imagined. This little girl first complained to him about how painful it was to be stabbed to death by a sword. The Lord must avenge her and so on. Then she briefly described the situation at that time. His heart skipped a beat when he heard Tia talk about the ability to turn weapons and magic into dust and disappear with the wind. There were many spells that could cause this effect, but if it was paired with the unique purple rose withering effect, then it would be a different story. There was only one possibility. In Brando's opinion, the element of corrosion was not a very powerful element. However, the person who mastered this element was enough to make his heart skip a beat. The Lord of Withering, Andesha, one of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders. With Martha as her superior, she was almost the strongest existence in Wonde. Why is she here? Brando's heart skipped a beat. He thought that it was ridiculous enough for him to create a reaction that attracted Cruz's people, Buga's Magi, and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. He did not expect the tree herders to be involved. Was the Lionheart sword that attractive? He immediately reacted. If the Lionheart sword was really a part of the Scepter of Fire, then the tree herders' presence here would be understandable. The Four Wise Ones were one of their biggest rivals. They were the first to prevent the Four Wise Ones' weapon from being reborn. This explanation was acceptable. Brando was not surprised at the death of Viscount Elman and the young alchemist after knowing that Andesha was here. Even if there were 10 of him, he would not be able to defeat a single finger of that woman's. But Brando was slightly relieved. Andesha's actions when she kidnapped Vahina suggested that her target was Cruz's envoy. That was good too. Among the Kurlut's people there was Veronica, the goddess of war of the Azure Skies Legion. At this time, Veronica's strength should be around level 70, which was the peak of the Wall of Law, elemental domain. Although she was probably not Andesha's opponent, Veronica was probably not the only one in the Kurlut's envoy group. Brando was very clear that Cruz's people were divided into several factions. Other than the Knights faction represented by the army, there were also the astrologers, the court magicians and the Holy Cathedral. Since the Holy Cathedral of Fire was going alone this time, there should at least be people from the Archmage Madron's side in the Kurlut's envoy. After listening to Tia's description, Brando calmed down and thought for a while. He thought that Cruz's mission this time was led by Veronica, so according to their rules, there should be at least 2 high-level magi in the envoy. With 2 high-level magi and Veronica, it was no wonder that Andesha did not dare to act rashly. But when the two sides met, it was inevitable that they would be impulsive. Brando could not help but start thinking about it. 2 high-level magi clashing with each other, and their strength was almost the same. What did this mean in the previous game? Brando's eyes lit up. This was the best opportunity to take advantage of the situation. If it was in the past, he wouldn't have hesitated to turn around and see if he could get anything out of this mess. Taking advantage of opportunities was one of the basic attributes of a player. However, he quickly calmed down and remembered that he was no longer a player. The battle between NPCs like Veronica and Andesha was not something that he could interfere with. If he was unlucky, it was understandable that he would die 10 or 20 times over. If it was in the previous game, he might be able to get back some money no matter how many times he died. But it was different here. Brando quickly forced himself to throw this terrifying thought out of his mind. He was afraid that he would lose his life in a moment of recklessness. He took a deep breath and felt a little relieved. No matter how strong Andesha was, she would not have thought of Tia's identity. Thus, that woman would not have thought that her whereabouts had been exposed. But since he knew that the old witch was active in this area, her threat was much smaller. Brando knew the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders very well. He had even fought with some of them personally. As for their habits and movements, he knew them like the back of his hand. Is it okay? Tia asked in puzzlement. That woman looks very strong. Don't worry. She might be in danger in the dark. But thank you, Tia. Tia smiled sweetly. At this moment, Brando looked up and immediately heard a familiar voice ask, "What's wrong?" Brando paused for a moment, then saw Amandina looking at him with concern. Her bright eyes in the dark made Brando feel a little uncomfortable. Why does it seem like this noble's attention is always on me? Nothing. What are you doing? Brando asked. Elder Wade has been looking for you for a long time, but you've been distracted the entire time. I told him that you were thinking about something, but he didn't dare to disturb you. The noble girl paused for a moment. There seemed to be other adventurers up ahead. You better go take a look. Ah. Brando was stunned. P.S. That was 4,000 words at noon. Students, seeing how awesome I am, please give me some recommendations, monthly votes, etc. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 405. What was in the Black Forest? That was a secret in itself. Rather than saying that Elder Wydd had found adventurers, it was more accurate to say that he had found their corpses. More than 30 corpses were strewn all over the forest. The corpses were dressed in light gray robes with silver armor underneath. Brando lifted the robes of the corpses and saw the crimson flame symbol on the silver armor. As expected, these were the guards of the Holy Cathedral. In fact, he had already noticed this when he entered the forest with Quinn and the centaur Elder Wydd. The swords scattered on the ground were also Cruz's style, but only the guards of the Holy Cathedral would be so ostentatious with their swords. If it were any other human army, he would have seen more or less battle axes or other standard weapons. Lifting his outer robe, he was now certain of this. They are the gray-robed soldiers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. He straightened up and said to Quinn and Elder Wydd, I wonder if there are any flame guards. They probably didn't encounter wolves, but it's strange to see more than 30 corpses neatly placed here. Elder Wydd said. Yes, if the Holy Cathedral had kept the corpses, they wouldn't have left their companions' corpses exposed in the wilderness. Even if they didn't have time, they would still have buried them. They knew that there were wolves in the forest. Brando walked to the next corpse and lifted the robes. Another soldier monk. More importantly, there are no signs of a fight. Quinn said. The occasional cries of the owls in the forest made his ears twitch. It's as if they just fell asleep. There are no obvious wounds on their bodies. Are they all the same? They are all the same. Brando finished examining the first 3 corpses. He then looked up and across the forest to the other side. There were more than 30 corpses lying on the ground or leaning against the trees. They were more or less in the same posture as when they were alive. Their eyes were closed and their weapons were not far from them. It was as if they had really fallen asleep. However, their pale and lifeless skin proved that they were dead people who had lost all signs of life. This scene was extremely strange. The centaur Elder Wydd and the tree elf leader Quinn did not make a sound. They were not surprised by the strange situation. No one could understand the dark forest. The deeper one ventured into the forest, the more it was like a giant nightmare that could silently enter one's dreams and take one's life. However, Brando's thoughts were different from theirs. It's just that I don't know if his life was taken away in an instant or if he had experienced something before. What was the cause of all this? Is it a wolf? Brando walked silently among the corpses, not daring to jump to conclusions. However, compared to the helplessness of the 2 natives, Brando had already found some clues from the state of the corpses. After all, the experience of a level 130 warrior was not for nothing. Regardless of whether it was Wade or Quinn, both of them had to address him as their senior. Brando suddenly stopped beside a corpse. He squatted down and saw that the soldier monk was holding a golden amulet tightly in his hand. He forcefully pulled the amulet out of the monk's hand. At the same time, he confirmed the time of death. The body was slightly stiff and the fingers were cold, no different from a wax figure. Brando then placed his hand on the monk's chest. There was still a trace of warmth. It seemed that the Holy Cathedral had just passed by. However, those people were one step ahead of him, which surprised Brando. This meant that the Holy Cathedral of Fire also knew about the Druids' plan and made use of them. Humph, these powerful forces are really good at gathering information. Brando could not help but think. However, he also knew that the Druids' plan was to hide from small forces like the Golden Mane Toquinin and Erwin. The wizards of Buga, the Holy Cathedral, and the people of Cruz had probably already guessed the outcome of tonight's operation. In other words, they were probably heading deeper into the Ring of Clouds. Brando raised his head and looked at the corpse in the forest. Was it really that easy to enter the loop of trade winds? No matter how powerful these giants were, they probably would not have guessed that he had already experienced it before. The deeper he went into this world, the more Brando felt that the players were once superior. He then raised the amulet and looked at it. In the middle of the amulet was a diamond-shaped amethyst. The amethyst had been blown up by the runaway magic. It was rumored that amethyst could ward off evil spirits, so it was often used to make amulets to ward off evil spirits. The fact that the soldier monk died with this amulet in his hand meant that he was already aware of the danger. Then his life wouldn't have been taken away in an instant. Brando immediately came to this conclusion. He then habitually wanted to keep the amulet in his bag, thinking that it could still be used. The items used by the Holy Cathedral were generally not bad. However, he quickly reacted. After all, this was not a game. If he touched the belongings of the dead, who knew if the two behind him would throw their halberds at him? Centaurs and tree elves respected the dead and the spirits the most. Brando put the amulet back into the hand of the dead soldier. It was not worth the risk since it was not a good item. In fact, Brando could already feel the gazes of Wydd and Quinn on him. He stood up and said with certainty, "These soldier monks were left behind to cover the rear." Cover the rear? The centaur elder was stunned. He saw the young human walking between the corpses and occasionally squatting down to examine them. At first he was slightly disdainful. Corpses would leave behind information, but only veterans, professional hunters and professional priests who had walked through mountains of corpses and seas of blood would be able to read the information. Wydd himself was an expert in this field. As a veteran warrior, he could easily distinguish whether the wounds were caused by blades, bites, or the effects of some kind of magic. However, when faced with such strange corpses, he was helpless. That young man walked around the corpses twice and could tell that they were left behind to cover the rear? That was probably just a guess. The centaur elder could not help but frown. As a commander, it was irresponsible to jump to conclusions so easily. He turned to look at the tree elves beside him. Quinn was also frowning, but the tree elves shook their heads at him, indicating for him to calm down. These indecisive tree stumps. The centaur elder, Wydd, was dissatisfied. Brando did not seem to notice Wydd's indifference. He walked to the other side and observed the battlefield. Then he confirmed a direction and pointed in that direction. It seems that the people from the Holy Cathedral came from that direction. It's similar to ours. Wydd was stunned. Quinn was also slightly surprised. When they found the corpses, they had ordered their men to search the area carefully. The druids were experts in this field. It did not take long for them to determine the direction the humans had entered and left from based on the fallen vegetation in the forest. Brando's judgment was almost the same as theirs. What? You don't believe me? Brando looked at their shocked expressions. You just have to search in that direction. There should be many traces left behind in the forest. No, Quinn asked. We just want to know how you know. Well? Brando thought that the Holy Cathedral had been using this kind of formation since the beginning of the game. This formation with 4 guards in the middle was modified by the players and became the most popular formation in the game. It was flexible, and there was enough time to react in case of an emergency. However, as the commander, he was very familiar with this kind of formation. Brando walked to the side of a tree. The Holy Cathedral entered the forest from this direction. The left wing swept through the forest. The scouts first discovered the enemy and then alerted the others here. He looked up and saw a corpse on the top of the tree. He then took 2 steps to the left. This corpse was the furthest away from the encampment. The enemy was too fast. There was no time to react, so the first to face the enemy was the Grey Knight on the periphery, the Holy Cathedral scouts. He lifted his robe and saw the insignia of the Grey Knight. Scarlet. Brendel turned around and shouted, "Come over here, go over there." He pointed to a position and said to Scarlet. The red-haired girl was originally standing beside Amandina and was observing the situation from afar, but she could not help but be startled when she heard the order. But as Brando's follower, her duty was to obey. Even though she did not understand, she still walked over. Brando used his hand to draw a circle around the position of the Grey Knight. He then looked at Wild and Quinn. The Grey Knight surrounded them in a semicircle with a wide distance. Their mission in this formation was to stall for time. These are the elites of the Holy Cathedral. They are well trained and are well aware of this. But there was no battle. Brando gestured for Scarlet to come over. She walked past the 6 corpses of the Grey Knight. They fell. The last Grey Knight must have been scared out of his wits. He began to turn around here. Brando looked at the traces of broken vegetation at his feet. He then raised his head and looked in another direction. He ran in that direction, but he was caught. There was no battle and he fell down dead. Brando said as he looked at the corpse. The enemy is strong. Brando gestured for Scarlet to continue walking into the forest. The left wing guards were prepared to face the enemy. The Holy Cathedral's decision was to have them cover the rear. They then left in that direction. He pointed outside the forest as if he had seen the situation with his own eyes. Wade and Quinn turned their heads back at the same time, and their expressions changed. Brendel had guessed correctly again. At this time, everyone heard a series of footsteps coming from outside the forest. The centaur elder and the tree elf leader turned around nervously. but they saw Erwin's men. It seemed to be a guy called Count Audine. In fact, Brando had ordered the troops to stop halfway up the mountain. Count Audine was really impatient, so he came up to check on the situation. But when he came up, he was shocked. The forest was littered with corpses. P.S. The battle for Valhalla has officially begun. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 406. When Count Audine saw the red emblem of the Holy Cathedral of Fire on the shining armor under the robes of the corpses, his expression changed again. Of course, he knew the soldiers of the Holy Cathedral. But so many of them had died. For Martha's sake, he knew the strength of the Holy Cathedral the best. He could not imagine what kind of enemy could make the monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire pay such a high price. Count Audine's gaze continued to move forward. The Grey Knight. When he saw the corpses at Brendel's feet, he was so shocked that he could not speak. These corpses were at least at the level of a priestess, which meant that there was at least one priestess in the Holy Cathedral team. Audine could not help but gasp. More than 30 soldiers of the Holy Cathedral died even with the help of a priest, and the Grey Knight? Who did the people of the Holy Cathedral meet? A priest of the Holy Cathedral must at least have elemental activation. As a spell profession that had elemental activation, it should be enough to win against a male wolf. However, the Count immediately had some strange thoughts. He looked at Brando and wondered if the young man had killed the soldiers of the Holy Cathedral. After all, in his opinion, there seemed to be nothing that the lawless young baron did not dare to do. He did not even care about Cruz's people. Maybe he really would do something so earth-shattering. Count Audine then thought of the relationship between Brando and the Druids. For a moment he could not help but think, could it be that these Druids wanted to start the Holy War? The high-ranking general from the Northern Legion swallowed a mouthful of saliva. However, Brando's words dispelled the Count's doubts. Of course, Brando noticed Audine's arrival, but he did not even look at the latter. Instead, he continued to walk through the forest and said, "The real battle began here." He asked Scarlet to stop, then pointed to the forest and said, "The battle ended the moment the enemy approached." Everyone thought they had attacked, but their weapons were still in their hands, and their arrows were still on the bow. Then the first batch of people died. Brando crossed the line of defense formed by the 10-soldier monks. They were all lying on the ground. Death is silent, like a breeze that brushed past their bodies. He looked at the corpses of the 10-soldier monks. They had all died at the same time. He looked up, and the invisible enemy continued to move forward. The second group of monk soldiers tried to pull away to buy time, but they fell at the same time. In the end, the remaining people seemed to have broken down. Some of them started to run away. This is why these corpses did not form a perfect defensive circle in the end. Brando replied. He looked around the forest. Judging from the arrangement of the monk soldiers, the creature was huge, but it passed through the forest without a sound. It must have used some kind of illusion when it took these people's lives, so there was no sign of a fight until death. But we can't rule out the possibility that it created an illusion to mislead these people. But if that's the case, the others from the Holy Sanctum shouldn't be able to escape. Brando looked at Wade and Quinn, and then at Austin, who was beside them. His calm gaze sent a chill down the three men's spines. It was as if there was a terrifying monster lurking in the forest, and it would hear their conversation at any time and appear like a giant ghost. The three of them were actually warriors who had experienced hundreds of battles, but this black forest was too strange. Those who were not familiar with it would feel a suffocating mystery, but those who were familiar with it could only see more of the unknown. But they could not imagine how the young man could stand in front of them and talk so casually. "Have you heard of something like this?" Brando looked back at the forest again. In fact, the current situation puzzled him. It was not that he had never seen a similar attack, but there were too many answers that fit the description. Moreover, no one dared to say that they had seen all the monsters in the wilderness. Some of the creatures born from chaos and magic did not make sense. Perhaps this terrifying killer was really a breeze that brushed past the forest. Perhaps, in order to narrow down the scope of the answer, he had to find the answer from the natives like Wade and Quinn. Brando thought that if he were to complete this plot with the mentality of a quest, then he would understand that there would be no quest that did not provide clues. Sounds like a ghost. Only a ghost in the legends would silently take away a person's life. Brando did not expect Count Austin to be the first to speak. After a brief moment of astonishment, the Count from the kingdom began to re-evaluate Brando. Perhaps it was his occupational disease, but Brando's reenactment of the battle was a new experience for him. If it was said that the Count had been looking at Brando with his personal feelings and prejudice, then he finally noticed some details that he had not noticed before. For example, when did such a person appear in Erewhon? The more he thought about it, the more he felt that something was amiss. What Baron of Aby's domain? Isn't Aby's domain located in Tanajul? If I'm not mistaken, isn't that Count Randner's worthless son the lord of this backwater village? Of course, as the most central existence in the noble circle, he was not sure if he remembered correctly, but he did not believe that this mysterious young noble was a country bumpkin lord. In his opinion, the so-called most outstanding young people of this generation that were widely rumored in the noble circles were nothing more than this. Most of them were just boastful people, but this baron in front of him was truly in an environment that was 1,000 times more dangerous than a battlefield, and yet he was still able to talk and laugh as if nothing had happened. Count Austin could not help but look at Brando with a strange gaze. He subconsciously thought that this person was lying. A ghost? Brando shook his head. First of all, it was impossible for there to be a ghost as large as a hill. Moreover, a ghost's method of attack was to steal the temperature of life, so the creatures they killed should at least be covered in a layer of ice. Elder Wydd and Leader Quinn shook their heads as well. There were many ghosts in the dark forest, and they had also dealt with them before, but it was clear that the current situation was different. Brando could not help but shake his head when he saw that no one could give him an explanation. He actually had a faint premonition in his heart. The moment they entered the loop of trade winds, they encountered such a scene. Or rather, the people from the Holy Cathedral of Fire were one step ahead of them and were attacked. Brando suspected that the creature hiding in the fog was the one that attacked the druids. But the creature only forced the druids to retreat, and now it started to kill them. Was it because the intruders were different, or was it because of the appearance of the path in the clouds? But no matter what, Brando knew that this creature should be the boss of this storyline quest. Even the Holy Cathedral of Fire did not seem to have the ability to resist, and only left behind more than 30 corpses. How strong is this thing? Brando faced such a conjecture without batting an eyelid, but his heart was filled with joy. It was fortunate that the guys from the Holy Cathedral of Fire were quick enough to block the attack for him. Otherwise, he really did not know if he could deal with this terrifying thing head-on. Originally, he thought that the player in the Amber Sword was much weaker than he was now, but he was still able to enter Valhalla and complete the quest. This meant that this quest shouldn't be too difficult. But he did not expect, holy shit, so that guy really did stumble into the center of the loop of trade winds by accident. Brando could not help but curse in his heart. But even so, his experience as a leader calmed him down quickly. Since he could enter the loop of trade winds by accident, it meant that this quest was not completely impossible. Otherwise, with the strength of this boss, not to mention the players at that time, it was estimated that the game would not be able to do anything even after 20 years. But fighting was definitely not feasible, so the goal of the quest should be to avoid fighting and find another way. But where was this shortcut? Brando was at a loss. No one would be willing to release the details of this quest for free, and those paid posts were too expensive. Who would spend money on a one-time quest that had already been completed? But Brando was now filled with regret. If he had known this would happen, he would not have thought that way. Veronica, the Magus of Buga, and the terrifying Andesha. Now, there was the boss that was even more terrifying than the three of them combined. Brando suddenly had a headache. He could not help but wonder if the difficulty of this quest could be a little bit higher. This was just an early storyline quest, wasn't it? Brando patted his forehead and subconsciously looked around to see if there were any clues. But when he turned around, he saw Scarlet staring blankly at her hand. He could not help but be startled. This red-haired girl did not have the habit of being absent-minded at this time. Scarlet? Scarlet was slightly surprised and raised her head. Brando thought that she had discovered something and asked, "What's wrong?" "There's something on my hand." Scarlet looked at her hand worriedly. Brando was startled. He thought that the blood of gods had relapsed. But what made him feel strange was that the effects of the golden apple should not have disappeared so quickly. But when he looked at her arm, he saw strange golden patterns on it. No matter how he looked at it, these patterns did not seem like the signs of the blood of gods. Instead, it seemed like magic was flowing under her skin. Brando felt that the patterns were familiar, but he could not remember where he had seen them before. He thought for a moment and shook his head. "This is not the blood of gods. Don't worry. But I think it's the effect of the golden apple. The golden apple itself contains a lot of magic." He looked up. "So the magic in your body resonates with the demonic wave. This is a good thing, not a bad thing." "A good thing?" Scarlett's worry faded a little. She knew that Brando would never lie to her, but she was still puzzled by Brando's words. Brando nodded. Yes, I may have thought of a way to make you an elementalist. But I'll have to wait until Lady Orthless wakes up before I can ask her about it. He could not help but sigh. Orthless was obviously a heroic spirit, but she did not have the self-awareness of a heroic spirit. She would sleep for 12 hours every day without fail. For Martha's sake, a heroic spirit should not have wrinkles. P.S. Looking for votes, looking for recommendations. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 408. The monks of the Holy Cathedral opened up a path in the forest, leading the unknown monster to some unknown place. However, Brando did not have the guts to follow. Who knew if the boss would turn back? However, as a Lord-tier monster, the entire periphery of the loop of trade winds was its range of activity. As long as they were still in the loop of trade winds, Brando knew that the chances of encountering the boss were very high. Moreover, according to the usual settings of the Amber Sword, the deeper they went, the more likely it was that the boss would be alerted. It was obviously not easy to complete Valhalla's quest easily. Fortunately, the Holy Cathedral had excellent Grey Knight scouts, but Brando's scouts were not bad either. In fact, the Fireclaw lizard men were slightly better. They were not the most professional scouts, but the telepathic connection between the planeswalker and the summoned creatures played a special role in this environment. There was no distance limit or time delay for telepathic connection, so Brando could expand the Fireclaw lizardmen's range of vigilance by several times compared to normal scouts. In order to make the perimeter even tighter, Brando also showed the Fireclaw Bugler card. When the fiery red lizard man with the horn entered the field, the card immediately activated its ability and sent another platoon of Fireclaw assault spearmen into the field. The number of Fireclaw assault spearmen under Ropar suddenly doubled. Fortunately, most of the Fireclaw assault spearmen were out of sight, so the sudden increase in numbers did not arouse suspicion. Fireclaw lizard men, countless wind spirit spiders, more than 30 rock leopards, 2 shadow rock beasts and a black wolf lord, Brando had an impenetrable warning system. It was soon noon when the team left the Holy Cathedral of Fire was first attacked. This was the third phase of the Planeswalker's 6 phases of the day. Brando tapped Ember Volcano to increase the number of fire elementals in the elemental pool, and at the same time he drew a Vampire Baron card from his deck into his hand. It was a pity that the Scorching Sun phase did not allow the use of black cards. Otherwise, Brando would have decisively placed this card into the field. What he lacked now was the best scouts. Blood Descendants were known for their speed. Coupled with their abilities as planeswalkers, they could be said to be the best land scouts in the world. Not to mention they could also fly short distances. After he finished drawing his cards, he looked up and saw that the fog in the mountain forest had begun to sink. The white mountain fog swirled around the forest in layers, lingering in the forest. In fact, the few gold-ranked powerhouses present had already keenly sensed that some of the unstable elements in the air were increasing. This was the rise and fall of the Chaos Sea beneath the elemental boundary, which caused the Black Moon's light to become even more dazzling. Magic power was welcoming the beginning of the strongest era in the past 1,000 years. It was just like the rise and fall of the tides, roaring to the entire world. The power of primal chaos became obvious. The most obvious change was that the temperature of the hills around Thorn Ridge suddenly became cold. It was as if they had entered a severe winter within a few hours. Everyone could even see frost forming on the tree trunks under their gazes. Everyone could not help but think of a hair-raising term, frost tide. It was one of the scariest natural disasters in the outer reaches of the dark forest. The temperature would drop below zero in just a few hours. Without the necessary protection, the extreme cold weather could kill any living thing within the affected area. Even the demons were not spared. Except for one. Winter wolves. Frost tide. Frost tide is coming. The centaurs immediately took out a pendant that looked like a crystal ball. The crystal ball was wrapped in a golden thread, and within it was a small fire seed. This fire seed could not open up a land of order, but it was like a torch in the darkness. It could at least stabilize the order in a small area of primal chaos. After leaving the Green Tower, adventurers would have to bring along a small fire seed if they wanted to go deeper into the forest. Otherwise, the harsh weather would kill anyone who ventured deep into the forest. It was a pity that not everyone understood this logic. The centaurs took out a fire seed and ignited it. A pillar of light shot up into the sky. Brando looked up and saw dark clouds gathering in the sky. Martha's codex, Tiamat, was dozens of miles behind the clouds in the sky. The outermost ring of gears at the edge of the transparent ring had already shattered. Black magic power was gathering. It was like a huge tentacle covering the sky. Then the southern sky flashed with layers of dark blue light, like thunder and lightning. The demonic wave was coming. Brando took out a fire seed from his chest. He naturally would not forget such an important matter. He cast 2 spells with his thumb and index finger, and the fire seed in his hand glowed brightly. A pillar of light shot up into the sky. Brando looked up. The pillar of light pierced through the dark clouds like a sharp thorn in the sky. The pillar of light flickered in his hand, reflecting the light of the centaurs not far away. Elder Wudd turned around to look at him in surprise. He didn't expect this young man to be so knowledgeable to even prepare something like this. Not every adventurer had the experience of exploring the Black Forest. Only the experienced adventurers would be well prepared and not panic in the face of the frightening power of the Black Forest. A third pillar of light lit up. It was the fire seed in Quinn's hand. It was not difficult to create a small fire seed. In the game it only cost a few thousand tor. Here it was as simple as a piece of agate. "You've been to the Black Forest before?" Elder Wudd asked as he walked over. Brando did not answer him directly. The frost tide was just a prelude, but at least it indicated that the second wave of attack would be the winter solstice wolves. In history, the first wave of wolves was the shadow and the second wave was the plague. This time there was a slight deviation from history. Brando thought that it might be because the NPCs here were different from the ones in history. A slight change in the order of the world could affect the course of history in the Black Forest. He felt a few cold snowflakes hitting his face and melting. The snowflakes were as hard as steel outside the range of the fire seed, but as soon as they entered the range of the fire seed, they quickly melted and shrunk. The second wave of wolves? Brando nodded and looked up. The demonic wave is coming. What? Look carefully. I'm afraid you won't be able to see such a magnificent scene twice in your life. Brando looked up at the sky and replied. Wudd turned his head and looked up as well. Then a gust of wind suddenly rose from the ground. The air swirled upward and brought countless dead trees and weeds into the sky. They gathered and formed a huge curtain of wind. The wind blew through the rolling mountains and hit everyone's face, blowing leaves and branches into the air. At that moment, everyone could not help but look up. Their hair fluttered in the wind, and they were surprised to see layers of leaves lifted from the treetops flying into the air. It was as if countless leaves were dancing in the air, converging into a black river hanging in the sky above the mountains. The river was moving forward. The fluttering leaves made it seem like a black army was marching. And higher up in the sky, thick black clouds rolled, and the clouds swept toward the middle of the sky like a tide. The sky in all directions surged, and everyone saw a flash of purple lightning shuttling through the clouds. The lightning lit up the clouds, but there was no rolling thunder. It was just silent lightning. Brando looked back and suddenly saw another beam of light shooting into the sky. It was fiery red and huge. It should be the fire seed of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. However, in the darkness, this light seemed to have awakened its other brethren sleeping in the forest. Beam after beam, in a moment, dozens of light beams were reflected in Brando's eyes. The orange-red Cruz people. The order of fire they controlled was not as pure as the Holy Cathedral of Fire, although they claimed to be the descendants of the Flame King Gretel. However, the gold of the Eagle Empire was added to the heat of fire. This color was enough to make them proud. Light green, that should be another druid. Then there was blue. Even the wind elves were here? Brando could not help but mutter in his heart. He could not figure out why the Lionheart sword was so attractive. However, what Brando did not consider was that he had triggered a reaction from the divine artifact. In the face of a divine artifact, no country would not be tempted. There were also a few light red ones. Brando guessed that they should be the knight orders of some duchy. The gray ones were naturally adventurers and mercenaries who did not belong to any faction. Brando's own fire seed was bought from the Green Tower. The fire seed made by the druids was naturally strong and gentle, so it was light green. It was similar to the fire seed in the hands of Wade and Quinn not far from him. There were 30 to 40 fire seeds in the forest. There were even more adventurers who did not prepare well enough and were annihilated by the extreme cold. Outside the range of the fire seed, the temperature dropped at an unbelievable rate. A layer of frost formed on the trees, and then the branches turned into ice crystals that fell to the ground. Snow began to fall from the sky, and in a short 10 minutes, the surrounding world was covered in white. Normal people who had not reached the strength of a gold would die in a few minutes in such an environment. Gold elementalists would only be able to survive for a day or two. Only those who had activated their elemental powers would not be affected. Brando took a deep breath. When he saw this scene, his heart was slightly shaken. It was not because of fear or nervousness, but because this scene was so familiar. It was as if time had turned back and he was back in the game, fighting side by side with the first batch of pioneers. That was not a story that belonged to him. But now it was. He looked further into the distance. The fire seed in the wall of roses had dimmed, and the pillar of light that shot into the sky was flickering. But since the wolves had not taken down the outpost, there was not much left to do. The druids of the Wall of Roses had managed to hold on, and it was due to the combined efforts of the various factions in this direction. Further away, the green tower's light was like a lighthouse in the dark. The pillar of light from the fire seed was like a golden sword piercing into the dark sky. But from afar, other than the northernmost 7 of the 12 outposts around the green tower, most of them were either dimmed or extinguished. Chaos brought lightning, rain, and snow. The weather in the distance was extremely strange. Rain poured down from the mountains in some places and lightning flashed in others. There were even thin ribbons in the sky. Those were tornadoes. The moment he turned around, he saw a huge pillar of light flickering for a moment before it was extinguished. The fire seed had been extinguished forever, and with it came the flames of countless lives. The weak advantage of the Wall of Roses was not enough to cover the fact that the druids' entire defense line was shaky. Even with the help of the players, the druids were only able to defend against 4 waves of attacks. If not for the opening of Valhalla, the calamity of wolves in the dark forest would have turned this area into ruins. That's why, Brando turned around and said, the second wave of attacks is coming. Let's hurry up. This forest is getting dangerous. Brando frowned when he said that. The winter solstice wolf pack was quite troublesome. The winter wolf was a very high-level magical creature. Although their numbers were smaller than the black wolf, they were much more terrifying. The northerners called the winter wolves ghosts that breathed in frost and fog, and it was not an exaggeration. If they were even a step slower in this forest, they would die without a burial place. That place. Wade looked at the place where the pillar of light had disappeared and was stunned. P.S. Wawa, it's still too late. Put up 2 chapters first, I'll continue writing. If you don't finish writing the 3rd chapter before 11 o'clock, then you don't have to wait. Get up early tomorrow and put it up. So, I'm still short of 2 chapters. Chapter 409. That place. WRD stared at the spot where the pillar of light had disappeared. It's nothing. The elder centaur seemed to have regained his senses. He turned around and walked towards the group of centaurs. What's wrong? Amandina asked curiously when she saw Wade's reaction. Before the frost hit, she had put on a long shawl to protect herself from the cold. That direction is the Arbor Forest, the homeland of many centaurs in the Green Tower. Brando replied. Amandina looked at the elder centaur's back sympathetically. But how did you know, my lord? Didn't the Deadwood Guardian guide mention it yesterday? Brando asked. I think so. Amandina was taken aback. But he only mentioned it casually. How did my lord remember it? She looked at Brando with envy and surprise. Brando quickly pretended to check his sword to prevent himself from laughing out loud when he saw Amandina's serious expression. Nonsense, how can I remember it? The problem is that the 12 outposts around the Green Tower, there will be 17 in the future, have become famous because of Valhalla. But this is not a good reason to tell others. Alright, let's go. Brendel interrupted the topic and said to Amandina. The wolves are coming. The forest was now completely dark, and the dim starlight and moonlight were hidden behind the clouds. When the demonic wave arrived, the world became pitch black, and the pillars of light in the forest became the only source of light in the world. The pillars of light were moving slowly. Brando felt a sense of déjà vu when he saw the first calamity of wolves in a video. Back then, only a few of the strongest players participated in the calamity of wolves. In the dark storm, a small number of players raised their fire seed and advanced towards Valhalla. The 20 pillars of light were like the last flickering flames of hope in the vast land. But they succeeded in the end. As for whether he would succeed, Brando did not know. He looked around, the forest was already silvery gray in the dark. With his near 25-ounce perception, he could see a white shadow flashing in the forest a few miles away. It was the winter wolf. The centaur elder Widd's voice came from the front of the group, and the group began to move forward. Previously, after trekking for nearly 10 hours, the group had already approached the southern end of the Thorn Ridge. A few miles away, Two intersecting black mountain ridges formed the entrance to the Kalenga mountain range. The terrain became undulating and precipitous in that direction, but as long as they passed through there, they would have passed the first checkpoint. Based on the team's speed, it would take them at most an hour to reach their destination. But that place was known as the Wolf Pass. It was also the most dangerous part of the journey. Brando looked around and saw that there were more and more winter wolves in the forest ahead, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The winter solstice wolves still needed some time to gather. He took out his pocket watch and saw that it was less than 90 minutes before the second wave of wolves arrived. Looks like we're just in time, Brando thought to himself. The group slowly passed through the last stretch of the Thorn Ridge. Occasionally, a few winter wolves would rush out from the snow, and naturally they were greeted by the centaur's arrows. Although Brando had already set up a tight perimeter around the group, the Fireclaw lizards, Shadow Rock beasts and Shadow wolves. Even though Brando called them rock beasts, it was a pity that Amandina, Coden, Carglays, and even Scarlet thought that it was a terrible name, so they simply ignored Brando's decision and called them Shadow wolves. In short, the perimeter that Brando had set up was to prevent the mysterious Lord-tier monsters from entering. As for the lone winter wolf, he did not mind the Fireclaw lizards helping him monopolize the experience points, but if there was a slightly larger group of wolves, he would order his summons to let them in. I don't want there to be a gap in this line of defense. The centaurs can still pay the price of casualties to deal with the winter wolves, but if the mysterious boss sneaks in without anyone noticing, then it won't be a problem of running away anymore. As for the winter wolves, they were silver-tier monsters and they were like white ghosts. These white shadows accompanied the wind and snow as they howled and shuttled through the forest. Every one of them was the size of a horse and they were as fast as lightning. They also possessed strength that ordinary people could not hope to match. The winter wolf's strength was outstanding even among silver-tier monsters. They could easily break a black pine tree that required a person to wrap their arms around it. Human silver-tier soldiers were as weak as ordinary people in front of these terrifying monsters. For example, there was once a winter wolf that broke into the ranks of Erwin's diplomatic party's night guards, and even under the siege of more than 10 silver-tier knights, the winter wolf bit one of them to death. However, if it was only strength, the winter wolves did not deserve to be called the ghosts of the forest that breathed frost and fog. The real terror of the winter wolves was that although they were not gold-tier monsters, they already had a part of the winter element. Their claws carried the most fatal cold damage, and as long as they lightly scratched your armor, you would be frozen into ice. Not to mention these monsters could also spit out frost breath from dozens of feet away, freezing your blood. It could be said that the only fortunate thing about facing these monsters was that the winter wolves did not have an alpha. Legend has it that the alpha of the winter wolves was killed when fighting for the throne with Ekis, the wolf calamity. Since then, the king of the forest did not allow the winter wolves to have an alpha. Every player in the Amber Sword knew that the winter wolves only had a wolf lord. It was these mini-bosses that united small wolf packs to form a real wolf pack. The winter wolves also seemed to understand their shortcomings, so these creatures that lived in ice and snow moved in at least 4 or 5 packs. 4 or 5 packs, hundreds of winter wolves, 7 or 8 lord-tier winter wolves, were considered a huge threat in any country in Wonde at this time of the year. Therefore, when they appeared at the periphery of the forest, a third of the 30 to 40 light pillars were extinguished in a moment. The extinguishment of the light pillars was self-evident. In the wind and snow, everyone became a little worried. The pressure in front was also increasing. The winter wolves were one of the most common threats in the northern border of Cruz, but not in the Black Forest south of Erwin. The centaurs were not used to fighting these unfamiliar enemies, and sometimes they could only passively choose how to take the winter wolves' attacks. Therefore the battle was bloody and tragic. However, this situation did not last for long. After Count Audine discovered the problem with the centaurs' tactics, he immediately took the initiative to look for Wade and Quinn. He said that he had some experience in fighting the winter wolves and wanted to temporarily take over the command. At this time he did not have much time to think. It was obvious that if the centaurs, tree elves and druids were defeated, they would not be able to survive this fierce battle. Count Audine also knew that in the whole of Erwin, there were very few people who were good at fighting the winter wolves. Even he himself only had experience fighting the winter wolves once or twice when he was traveling in Cruz. However, things did not go as he expected. He quickly found out that there was someone who had more authority to speak about the winter wolves. It was the young man who called himself the Baron of Abes. Brando caught up from behind and took over the command without saying a word. Then he, Scarlet, and Coden entered the front line of the battle, and it seemed that in an instant the situation of the battle was reversed. At that moment, according to Quinn, it was as if there was a ruler in the young man's heart. Every time the winter wolves stopped, the young lord would raise his sword and order the centaur elders to stop, then throw their javelins at the white specters to inflict heavy damage to them. Every time the winter wolves stopped, the young lord would raise his sword and shout out an order for the centaur elders to stop, then throw their javelins at the white specters to deal heavy damage. Although the winter wolves' attack was outstanding, their defense inherited the weakness of wolf-type monsters. When faced with an attack from an upper silver-ranked monster, it would only take 1 or 2 attacks to kill them. After a rain of javelins, a pack of wolves would lose a quarter of its members. However, when the winter wolves charged, the centaurs were also prepared. The centaurs in the front row retreated, revealing the 2 rows of javelins at the back. It could be said that in the face of the same attack, the first move was crucial in determining the outcome of the battle. Unfortunately, the winter wolves did not have the right to make the first move in front of Brando. Brando pressed his hand on his sword and stood in the middle of the centaur army, looking at the white specters in the distance. He thought to himself that he had earned nearly 1,000,000 EXP from the winter wolves in the past. If he could not win this battle, he should go home and plant sweet potatoes. Cruz, Erwin, and the monsters around the Knight's Kingdom, Grace and the Kingdom of Knights. He knew all of them like the back of his hand. With nearly 100 years of experience in the game, he was familiar with all of them. But in the game, this was the knowledge of all the players living in these countries. Brando's knowledge was not superior at all. But here, history was intertwined, weaving a wonderful brocade under Brando's feet. The heavily injured wolves finally retreated far away, howling maliciously in the forest. Count Audine could not believe his eyes. He did not even realize that his hand had left the hilt of his sword that he had been clenching tightly. Isn't this the standard tactic used by Cruz's White Frostfall army to deal with the winter wolves? At this moment, Count Audine almost thought of the old Cruz soldier who taught him how to deal with the winter wolves. They were both experienced, but the young man in front of him was obviously much more efficient. However, Count Audine did not know that at this time, on another mountain a few miles away, someone was sighing just like him. Cruz's men? A swordsman with a 5 to 6 feet long sword on his back stood in the dense forest on the mountain. He was wearing a grayish-brown robe and looked young, but his shoulder-length hair had already turned gray. He was looking at the battle between the centaurs and the winter wolves from afar. The man's grayish-brown eyes moved and a trace of doubt flashed in his eyes. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 410. Brando didn't know what Audine was thinking. However, as time passed, he continued to command the troops to move forward. The slaughter seemed to have slowed down the passage of time. The centaur elders' armors were dyed red with blood. The blood of the winter wolves and their own blood were plated layer by layer on the shiny silver armor. Hundreds of centaurs and tree elves advanced along a long and narrow mountain stream. When they looked up, 2 intersecting mountain shadows covered half the sky. That was the Wolf Pass. Another white wave surged from the front. More than 1,000 winter wolves surged from the direction of the pass. Among the wolves, the Winter Lord raised half of its body and howled at the sky. Its snow-white mane fluttered in the wind, looking majestic. Amidst the rumbling of the earth, the wolf pack split into 3 groups. Snowflakes boiled under the wolf's claws. From the sky, it looked like a trident was charging towards the centaurs. White shadows shot into the forest on both sides, like pale ghosts leaping through the forest. The wolves opened their jaws and surrounded them in an instant. The leader of the tree elves, Quinn, raised his hand. Hundreds of tree elves drew their bows and shot. The interval between drawing an arrow, drawing the bow, aiming, and releasing the arrow was less than 2 seconds. Their movements were as fast as lightning. They were used to shooting freely, and even then the arrows were as dense as raindrops. The winter wolves on both sides were hit by arrows and fell to the ground. However, their advantage in numbers allowed them to continue to advance, gradually threatening the flanks. They're much harder to deal with than the black wolves. Brando slashed a winter wolf pouncing towards him with his sword. He took a deep breath and exhaled a white mist. He looked up and saw that the left wing was exposed to the winter wolves. He had no choice but to raise his sword and order a company of Fireclaw lizard men to enter the fray. They charged out from the side of the forest and collided with the winter wolves. "Mr. Brando," Quinn shouted. "Javelins." A row of javelins flew into the air and pierced into the winter wolves in front of them. The first 3 rows of winter wolves fell to their knees, and the monsters behind them leaped over the corpses of their companions. It was like a white wave crossing a dam. The centaur and the winter wolf were like two waves of snow rushing towards each other in the valley, as if they were destined to collide at some point in time. But at the same time, the snow-white wolf shadows in the forest formed an attack arrow that surrounded them. Looking down from the sky, the snow-white trident was closing in on a vast area. Less than 1 li away from the wolf pass, this was the last sprint. There were more and more winter wolves in the forest, so they had to act quickly. Brando raised his head and looked at Wild. The centaur elder placed his hand on his left chest and nodded solemnly. Then the centaur elder suddenly raised his halberd and sped up, leaping out of the centaur army. "Warriors of Naya," he cried. A row of elderly centaur guards patted their left chests and followed behind him without a change in expression. An entire row of centaur warriors raised their halberds high in the air, galloping their horses as they followed closely behind Wade. At that moment, the scene seemed to have formed a static balance in the midst of motion. The unique movement of the centaurs attracted everyone's attention. Be it their tree elves or druids, they all stared blankly as a third of the centaurs stepped out from the crowd. Under Wade's lead, they formed an independent attack arrow in front of the charging army. Count Audine was commanding Erwin's knight to rush to the right flank to protect the tree elves who were exposed to the claws of the winter wolves. But when he turned around and saw this scene, he was stunned. He was not the only one. Erwin's knight held their breaths. As soldiers, of course they knew what the centaurs were going to do next. At that moment, most of the knight raised their hands to their left chests. This was a blessing between comrades. But on the other side of the battlefield, the Winter Lord also let out a long horn, and the winter wolves flowed like a tide. Some of the winter wolves leaped out of the crowd and formed an independent attack arrow in front of the army. Their battle strategy was exactly the same as the centaurs. Under Scarlet's protection, the noblewoman who was out of breath from running stared at the winter wolves in a daze. Quinn pointed the end of his longbow in that direction and shouted, "Open a path for our glorious companions." The tree elves immediately gave up on the flanks and drew their bows again. This was the first time the tree elves had shot in unison since they entered the battlefield. The huge elven longbows were drawn to a full moon, and creaking sounds could be heard. Arrow of life. Strong wind east. 200 feet, 150 feet, fire. The archers released their bowstrings in unison, and everyone seemed to hear a soft buzzing sound at the same time. A black shadow covered the sky and covered the earth, like a flock of migratory birds flying high into the sky. The arrows flew to the highest point in the sky and swooped down like a bird of prey. The rain of arrows fell on the heads of the winter wolves as if the grim reaper waved his scythe, and countless winter wolves fell to the ground. In an instant, the lone arrow of the winter wolves was nailed to the ground like a porcupine. Then, the winter wolves at the back leaped over the corpses that had turned into statues. They no longer had the time to change their formation because the centaurs had formed a straight line and were about to collide with them. A dull sound of collision could be heard from the battlefield. In an instant, the white wave and the silver line formed by the centaurs collided. Most of the centaurs immediately fell to the ground and were swallowed by the white wave. The silver line only existed for a moment before disintegrating. But at least the flood of winter wolves was stopped for a moment. The white wave of snow stagnated. Then they realized that Brando's army was charging towards them. The centaurs were not afraid at all. Instead they sped up. Brando raised his sword and shouted, "Assault formation." He took the lead. With him as the center, the tip of the arrow became sharp. The army was charging forward. At the same time, Quinn pointed his longbow behind him and shouted, "Warriors of the forest, stop the enemy." Whoosh. Vines emerged from the mud and stone slabs of the valley, blocking the rear of the army. The tree elves at the back threw away their longbows and turned around, unsheathing the long swords on their backs. They turned around, stopped, and separated themselves from the army, forming a thin line of defense. The winter wolves at the flanks immediately realized that there was a human wall in front of them. 20 feet. The enemy was close. Brando gripped Haurangaya with both hands as he charged forward. He could see every strand of white hair on their bodies trembling in the cold wind. Less than half of the 100 centaurs that Wade had led were left. The centaur elder charged into the winter wolves alone. With a flash of his halberd, a winter wolf was sent flying. Brando saw all of this. He took a deep breath and raised Haurangaya. "Come, the blood of a warrior." Brando had not felt the blood in his body boiling and rushing to his brain for a long time. It was this feeling that made him persevere on this path. The path of a warrior. That's why I say to charge forward without hesitation. Brando closed his eyes, then opened them again. This is the romance of a warrior. The moment he opened his eyes, he activated charge. At the same time he swung Haurangaya in front of him, and a white light flashed parallel to him. In the eyes of outsiders, Brendel was one man and one sword, charging into the pack of wolves with a flash of white light. Wherever the sword passed, armor flattened, flesh and blood splattered. It was as if a silver line had been drawn into the winter wolves. With this silver line as the center, the winter wolves parted to the sides. They did not take the initiative but rather they parted with a rain of blood. Because of the speed, the power of Haurangaya only exploded after the man and the sword had passed. It looked as if the ground behind Brando was cracking. As soon as Brendel passed by, there was a rumbling sound of sharp rocks piercing the sky behind him. A gap appeared in the winter wolves' defense. Brando and Wydd passed by each other. A winter wolf that had pounced on the centaur elder was immediately split into two. Its large head flew high with a rain of blood. Wydd looked up and saw Brando's back. The centaur elder shook off the blood on his halberd and snorted softly. Behind Brando, the centaur army, led by Scarlet and Coden, pierced into the gap like a wedge. Under the huge impact, even the winter wolves could not resist. Without the momentum they could only retreat. Ropar's Fireclaw lizards and Audine's knight entered from the left and right flanks respectively. The gap in the center of the winter wolves was finally torn open. Brando swung his sword forward, and a white wind blew away several winter wolves. He looked up and realized that he had killed a winter wolf. There was a clear path ahead. They're here. Brando took a deep breath. He looked back and saw Coden and Scarlet leading the centaurs from the left and right. Then came the tree elves, followed by Erwin's knight and Ropar's Fireclaw lizards. But when he looked behind him, his eyes suddenly narrowed. Wydd and his centaur vanguard had not caught up. The centaur elder raised his halberd and signaled for the remaining centaurs to move closer to him. The centaurs once again formed a human wall. They were covering the rear. With their own lives. Wydd. Brando was shocked. This was not his original plan. But the centaur elder only looked back and raised his hand to make a gesture. Almost no one understood the gesture, but Brando and Quinn understood. It was the common language of the forest citizens. We are the children of the forest. At that moment, Brando suddenly held his breath and closed his eyes. P.S. So today I'm putting up 3 chapters. There's still 1 chapter left. Ooh, it's so painful to pay off debts. I'm rolling on the ground. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 411. The winter wolves that had been beaten into a daze were regrouping in front of the centaurs. Like a wave of snow, they would soon gather and swarm over, mercilessly swallowing Wade and his subordinates. Amandina, Coden, and Quinn all turned to look at the direction of the winter wolves. Austin did the same not far away. There were only a few knights of Erwin and nobles left behind, but none of them could make a sound. Once upon a time, Erwin had the spirit to pursue such a belief. Count Austin subconsciously tightened his grip on the sword in his hand. He turned around and said to Dolent, "Count Dolent, I'll leave the envoy group to you." He didn't know if Dolent was blessed by the heavens or he was just too lucky to be able to hold on until now. Me? Dolent was taken aback. Count Austin, what are you trying to do? Austin turned back with an expressionless face. For the first time, his eyes burned with something that had never been there before. He pointed his shining sword forward and shouted, "Knights of Erwin, one day will you watch your comrades fight alone and die on the battlefield." The knight was slightly stunned. They looked at their commander and subconsciously took a deep breath. "No, we won't. Because the lion's flag flies high," Austin shouted. The belief of the past has never faded. He turned to look at the knight. "Follow me, you are the sharp swords of Erwin." Austin turned back and charged into the battlefield. The knight shouted, "Swear on the sword," and the Green Knight charged into the winter wolves. They were Erwin's knights. Dolent was stunned. He looked at the scene in a daze and did not even say a word to stop them. He was not the only one who was taken aback, even Brendel was taken aback. But when he looked at these people he suddenly felt a lump in his throat. This was Erwin's belief. Even if it was deeply corrupted, it still shone with a light that people yearned for in the darkness. This was the meaning of so many people fighting for it. This was also the reason why countless players loved this land. Many people wrote such words on the forum. "We are not strong but we love it." At this moment, Brando suddenly remembered the meaning of the name of this country. In the glorious past, Yak named this land Erwin in order to wish for miracles. If he didn't believe in miracles, then Erwin wouldn't have any reason to exist. He suddenly felt that he couldn't say a word. He simply raised the Haurangaya in his hand. Ropar, bring up the rear. The Fireclaw Lizard Man Lord withdrew his gaze from the humans and centaurs. He then bowed deeply to Brando and spoke for the first time in days. The true essence of war lies in honoring a warrior's honor. As for what we fight for, that is of great significance to our Fireclaw clan. The Fireclaw Lizard Man Lord lowered his head and said, but no matter what, pursuing one's faith is an incomparably glorious thing. It raised its head. So thank you, Master, for giving us such an opportunity to fight side by side with such a group of people. The Fireclaw clan will not disappoint you. Ropar waved his hand and the Fireclaw Lizard men entered the battlefield. Brando turned around. Let's continue forward, he said softly to Quinn. After passing through the last wolf pack, they had passed through the first layer of the loop of trade winds. Next was the storm circle. The tree elf leader didn't say a word from beginning to end. He only nodded silently. The group continued forward. After passing through the last line of defense of the winter wolves, the wolves in front of them finally became sparse. In the remaining time, after experiencing several small-scale battles, the remaining people finally crossed the Wolf's Pass. The Wolf Pass was the desperate situation of the calamity of wolves. After passing through the pass formed by the two towering peaks of the Kalanga Mountains, they entered the inner region of the loop of trade winds. This was the so-called storm circle. Only after passing through the wall of storms would they be considered to have entered the core region of the loop of trade winds. The storm circle would not produce the calamity of wolves, but there were more powerful monsters lurking within. This was no longer a suitable place for a large group to advance. In other words, the centaurs and druids had completed their mission at this point. However, the group that started with hundreds of people was now left with only 100 or 200 people. Even the youths under his command had lost more than a third, and this was the result under the protection of Coden and Scarlet. Among the 6 youths, one of them had died, while the other was heavily injured. This was their first battle and the result was cruel. Not to mention that many of them had also lost their lives for this. Count Audine, Wade, the Erwin Knight and the Centaurs. At this time, Brando could not help but look back at the mountain stream that they had passed through. In that direction, a pale green pillar of light flashed in the dark sky and finally disappeared. Everything returned to darkness. Seeing this scene, Brando did not say anything, but he felt an inexplicable sense of loss. Although he knew that many people would lose their lives in the face of the calamity of wolves, when it really happened, Brando found that he was not prepared. He thought that after going through so much, his heart would have long been made of stone. He turned his head and saw Amandina's bright eyes looking at him. Brando was slightly stunned. He did not know what this Amandina was thinking. Was she disappointed? In his eyes, Amandina's requirements for him were quite strict, or perhaps it should be said that she had high expectations. This noble girl always seemed to want to see a more perfect side of him. A perfect lord? But Brando believed that he would never be able to achieve this. He was himself, and besides the greed in his heart, he could be considered as an ordinary person. Compared to those monstrous geniuses who had every step under their control, perhaps he looked more like a guy with good luck. Even in the past he wasn't the best player, nor was he the strongest warrior, was he? Brando blinked and sighed. But the noble girl seemed to be keenly aware of his thoughts. She looked at him and said softly, I think, in fact, there are some things that do not have a correct answer, my lord. Brando was slightly stunned. He looked at Amandina. This did not sound like something this noble girl would say. I used to be strict with myself. Amandina only smiled at Brando, her lord, but I think if you do not feel regret for something all the time, then it would be scary. Because no matter what, people can't be detached from their own feelings. I think this is the nature of humans, she smiled, but it is because of this or that dissatisfaction with ourselves that we can surpass ourselves. That's why I feel more at ease when I'm with such a real lord. You. Brando blushed. You know what I think? Amandina put her hands behind her back and nodded lightly. In the end, my lord and I are the same kind of people. Brando coughed and turned around. He saw Quinn nodding at him not far away. Lord Brando, the tree elf leader said, life is precious, so this kind of sacrifice is worthy of respect. Brando raised his head and looked at the flashing pillars of light in the forest. He suddenly said, there are so many people here who hold the flame of civilization in their hands. But how many people are there who are truly fighting for justice? He looked at Quinn and said, in the end, I only allied with you to borrow your strength. There is no such thing as a person with a pure heart, Lord Brando, Quinn replied as he looked around vigilantly. "Can I ask you a question?" "What is it?" "Lord Brando, if you achieve your goal, and you only need to pay a small price to make the outcome better, such as saving the Green Tower, will you do it?" "Why not?" Brando asked. Quinn turned around and smiled. He then spoke in the ethereal language of the elves. "So, do you still not understand, Lord Brando? Kindness in your heart doesn't need to be said, but it is already the most precious thing in the world. That's why I said it before. If you are Lord Brando, I think you can become an ally of the people of the forest." Brando was slightly startled. He took a deep breath and nodded. "But," Scarlet, who had been silent all this while, suddenly asked, "most people would think this way. If it's effortless?" Quinn turned around and looked at her. He paused for a moment before speaking. "If it's not the wish of most people, how can there be a civilized world?" "What do you mean?" Scarlet was puzzled. "If there's no such thing as kindness, we won't speak. Without words, we won't need to communicate," Quinn replied. He looked up as if he suddenly thought of Wild. They had fought side by side for many years. Even though they often joked about who would die first, he didn't expect this day to come so suddenly. The tree elf took a deep breath. "Without spiritual communication, what's the difference between humans and beasts?" Scarlet was stunned. Everyone else fell silent. Suddenly, a clear voice came from the nearby forest. "The difference between humans and beasts is that they are afraid of fire, but we yearn for light. The fire of civilization burns brightly in the wilderness. It illuminates not only the chaos but also the human heart. But for thousands of years, the descendants of the Flame King seem to have forgotten this." Following this voice, a man carrying a two-handed greatsword that was taller than a man slowly walked out from the forest. He stopped in front of Brando and looked up at them. The man raised his head and looked at everyone. That pair of strange gray eyes seemed to be dim, but it made everyone's heart skip a beat. They felt as if they were being locked on by the other party's aura at the same time. "Who is this guy?" Coden, Scarlet, and Quinn raised their weapons. A strong man suddenly appeared in the wilderness and blocked their path. No matter how they looked at it, it was more like an enemy than a friend. But Brando was the only one who didn't move, because he was looking at this guy with a face full of disbelief. The Ash Sword Saint, Mephisto. Author's note, Chapter 2, Ash Sword Saint. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 412. In the whole of Wond, there were a lot of famous legendary figures that the players were familiar with. Some of them were famous sword saints such as Veronica, who was known as the goddess of war, or Darius, the earth sword saint who could split a mountain with his sword. Even Buga, who was unknown in this era, would become a famous sword master in the future. There were also legendary wizards such as Tulman of the Silver Castle, William of the Scroll King, Kira the Iron Smelter. There were also talented generals such as Black Lord Insursta, Falcon Nicholas, Long Blade Lord Harrison, and Valkyrie Freya. But among these people, none of them were as respected as Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles. There was no other reason. As the only person in Wond who dared to declare war on an entire empire, this courage alone was enough to win the hearts of everyone. Brando remembered that it was almost 30 years ago. At that time, the insufferably arrogant crews completely destroyed the resistance of a small country called the Duchy of Sutherland after a series of victories. As usual, this small country on the border was incorporated into the territory of the empire. In the history of Cruz's 1,000 years of war, this was just a small point that should have been unremarkable. But this time the Eagle Empire encountered an enemy that gave them a headache. In the Whistling Year, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles appeared in the vision of Cruz. The first time he appeared was during the Battle of Cruz's royal city, where he single-handedly tried to assassinate the emperor of the empire. Of course he didn't succeed. But in this battle, Mephistopheles single-handedly destroyed an entire battalion of Cruz's royal guards, a battalion of the border guards, and 2 squadrons of the royal city guards. 3 viscounts, 1 earl, more than 20 lieutenants, and 3 times the number of reserve officers of the Empire's officer academy died in the hands of this Ash Sword Saint. If the loss of 3 viscounts and 1 count was only a humiliation to the Empire, then the loss of the 2 companies of reserve officers truly infuriated the sovereign of the Empire at that time. The reserve officers of the King's City Garrison Guard were undoubtedly the elites of the Empire. They were the future pillars of the Empire. Who would have thought that 2 squadrons of them would be wiped out by Mephisto? Even for someone as wealthy as Cruz, he would feel the pinch. However, what happened next was beyond everyone's expectations. In a fit of rage, the Empire sent out the most powerful capture team in history. The commanders of the 4 major armies, the president of the Imperial Alchemist Association, and even 3 Imperial sorcerers from the Tower of Stars and Moon. As for how strong this formation was, one only needed to know that Veronica, the leader of Azure Firmament, was the most junior member of the team. One could imagine what kind of old monsters this team was made up of. However, it was this formation that allowed Mephisto to escape with serious injuries. This incident not only made the Kurlutzians lose face, it could be said that it was a slap in the face of the Kurlutzians who had been insufferably arrogant for centuries, but it also set off a brazen wave in all of Vaunt. After that, the Temple of the Wind Empress and the Templar Church tried to find Mephistopheles, trying to use his hatred for Kurlutz to make him join their forces. Unfortunately, since then this guy seemed to have disappeared and no one had seen him again. There were rumors that he died from his injuries. Of course, Brando knew that this was just a joke. After all, Mephisto had a rather important quest line. The players of the Amber Sword couldn't be more familiar with this pervert. What Brando didn't expect was that this guy would appear here in advance. The next time he appeared in history was almost 5 years later. Therefore, the moment he saw Mephisto, there was only one thought in his mind. Is the Lionheart so attractive that even this old pervert is here? Brando stared at the man in front of him with his mouth agape. He felt that if he could stare at the man in front of him, he would have done so long ago. At this moment, Mephisto was wearing a gray robe with a cloak and a sword on his back. Of course, the most distinguishing feature of his was his long gray hair and gray eyes. It could be said that there was no other human in the world with such unique hair and eye color. This was because Mephisto's hair and eye color were affected by his element. Gray Sword Saint Mephistopheles' element was the Song of Gray. It was a strange element, but if you really fought him you wouldn't think so. In the past, Brando had only fought Mephisto once. That was when he completed the Black Iron Body quest. The goal of the quest was simple, to last 10 seconds under Mephisto's attacks. Brando remembered that during his first quest, he had used all the buffs he could drink and eat. Then he was instantly sent back to the Resurrection Altar in 3 moves. This wasn't because of level suppression. To be honest, Mephisto was only level 70 or 80 at his peak, but his swordsmanship was terrifying. The Sword Saint of Grey was only a title of Mephisto's, but in reality, many players believed that Mephisto was the only NPC who had trained his basic swordsmanship to level 25 and above. Although this rumor wasn't credible, it was enough to show that this guy's swordsmanship was terrifying. It was even beyond the limits of strength. Brando looked at Mephisto, his mind racing. Although he didn't know much about Mephisto's personality, he knew that this guy was definitely not someone with a good temper. Just look at the things he did. Was this person standing in front of them an enemy? Or a friend? It was hard to say. But what made him frown was that Mephisto had a good impression of Erwin in history. He also didn't have any entanglements with the Druids. Logically speaking, he shouldn't be an enemy. But he wasn't an enemy. Brando looked at Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles who was standing in the middle of their path. He felt that his reasoning was somewhat unreliable. But at least he knew that in front of such a powerful existence, his judgment didn't have much meaning. It all depended on the other party's mood. Therefore, Brando didn't say anything and didn't do anything to avoid angering this guy. He just raised his head and looked at the other party. The scene was silent for a few seconds. While Brando was sizing up Mephisto, the Sword Saint was also sizing them up. His eyes first swept over the few remaining Erwin nobles, then fell on Brando. Crew's people? Mephisto stretched out his hand, and the great sword on his back flew out and landed in his hand. Then he pointed the tip of the sword at Brando and asked. Brando was startled. He looked at Mephisto dumbfoundedly. At that moment, it was as if he heard the sound of heaven and earth shattering. Brando only felt cold sweat on his back. What kind of joke is this? Holy shit, Brando thought to himself. Kurlutz? I'm a popular Tauren. But if this guy thinks I'm a cruise person according to the other party's habits, I'll be cut in half immediately. Of course, Brando didn't want to die without knowing why, so he quickly shook his head. No, he replied. Sir, I think you've got the wrong person. I'm a Erwin person. Erwin person? Mephisto looked at Brando and replied, It looks like it, but Erwin people don't know the tactics of the Falling Frost Army. Tell me, are you a member of the Falling Frost Army? Brando realized that it was his tactic of letting the centaurs use the Falling Frost Army to fight against the winter wolves that attracted this monster. At this moment he felt even more wrong than Do-E. In the past, not to mention the players of Erwin, even the players of Madara knew this tactic. It was nothing more than a test of experience. There was nothing technical about it. As long as one looked at a video on the internet, it would be clear at a glance. But there was no way to explain this, so Brando could only think of a way to quibble. Sir, there are many people who know that tactic. After all, tactics are dead but people are alive. It's not only Erewhon people who know how to deal with the winter wolves, right? Brando felt that although his excuse was clumsy, there were no loopholes. The truth was that even in this world, there were many people who knew the tactics of the Falling Frost army. This was not a secret to begin with. For example, Count Audi knew it. But he did not expect Mephisto to not be swayed at all. On the contrary, the Sword Saint smiled slightly with an expression that said, "Everything is under my control, don't try to quibble." Then he looked at Brando and said, "Indeed, it's possible to use this tactic more skillfully than the commander of the Falling Frost army. Young man, you're the first person I've seen who can use this tactic." "As far as I know," he said again, "it seems that other than Cruz, Erewhon doesn't suffer from the winter wolves, right?" At that moment, Brando felt as if a bolt from the blue had struck his head. There was only one voice echoing in his heart. Natural idiocy is the cause of death. I'm innocent. Brando felt like crying at this moment. He did not expect that the tactic that he had repeatedly practiced in the game to deal with the winter wolves in order to gain experience would be fatal at this moment. But it seemed that this was the truth. According to Mephisto's way of understanding, Brando soon realized that he really did not have a way to explain it clearly. Indeed, how could he explain the fact that a person from Erewhon could use the tactic so skillfully against the winter wolves? Not to mention that this was something that did not make sense in itself. More importantly, even if a person from Erewhon wanted to practice, as Mephisto said, he had to have a place to practice, right? Brando could not help but rub his hands together. His expression suddenly became a little strange. In fact, he had always thought that his experience was a great cheat, but he did not expect that one day this cheat would finally bring him great trouble. "Lady Martha, do you have to be like this? You're not playing with me, right?" The young lord looked at Mephistopheles with a strange expression on his face and sighed miserably in his heart. "I'm telling the truth, Mephistopheles, boss Mephistopheles, can you not be like this? I can explain. P.S. Alright, actually this is the third update. Try to pay off your debt by tomorrow. If I'm loving enough, I'll give you a little dessert the day after tomorrow." Chapter 4:14. Brando's mind raced. In fact, he had a lot of things that could prove his identity, but the most convincing one was the White Raven sword art and the brooch given to him by the princess. The White Raven sword art was the secret sword art of Erewhon's palace. Anyone who saw it would suspect that he was related to the royal family of Erewhon. The White Raven sword art was derived from the Holy Cathedral of the Wind Empress, so it had nothing to do with Cruz. The brooch was the symbol of the Royal Knight Order of Erewhon. Even if the Cruz people had a way to get it, they would not use it as a disguise. Even the weak Erewhon would not accept such humiliation. As the saying goes, a rabbit will bite when cornered. Although the Cruz people were not afraid of Erewhon's strength, they would not want to get involved in a war for no reason. It could be said that the high-ranking nobles of the Cruz people would not bother to disguise themselves as Erewhon people. If the other Cruz people chose to do so, they would have to consider the consequences. Although the Cruz people were protective of their own people, they would not get involved in a war for a nobody. Therefore, whether it was the White Raven sword art or the emblem of the Royal Knight Order, they were the best evidence to prove that he was one of Erewhon's people. However, Brando hesitated for a while and decided to use the White Raven sword art to prove himself. After all, the brooch was a secret agreement between him and the princess. Brando could guess from the history and the princess letter that the nobles who supported the royal family of Corvado were not united. Although there were loyal subjects like Oberway and Benninger, there were also people like Woods and Makarov who were wavering in the middle. Not to mention the people under Duke Anthony who had their own plans. It was not hard to imagine that not everyone wanted the princess to get in touch with him. Some of them might even try to stop her. Even though Brendel did not know that he had already guessed the situation, he had a rough idea in his heart. He could imagine that Her Royal Highness had given this brooch to him despite all the pressure she was under. In fact, it was a sign of trust. This kind of insignificant support did not have any practical meaning, but it gave Brando a sense of trust. As a modern person, Brando could not have the feeling of a knight swearing loyalty to the king, but at least he felt a faint sense of satisfaction in his heart. Brando did not know what this feeling was. But he knew that if he casually used this kind of trust, it would put the princess thousands of miles away in a disadvantageous position. Even though this had nothing to do with him, he subconsciously chose to avoid this option. "Mr. Mephisto." Brando took a deep breath and put away the feeling of being inexplicably pointed out by Mephisto. He said seriously, I think you're mistaken about one thing. Oh, you know me? Mephisto snorted softly. He looked at Brando coldly and said, but it's useless to say more. Where is Veronica? Brando was stunned. Mephisto was looking for trouble with Veronica. He must have heard from somewhere that Veronica had left Cruz alone, so he came all the way here. Brando was secretly shocked. Mephisto had spent a lot of effort to catch up with Veronica. There were no less than 10 sea and land routes from Cruz to Erewhon. After entering the Black Forest, there was no trace of Veronica. How much hatred did Mephisto have for people from Cruz to do this? But there was one thing that made him speechless. Where was he going to find Veronica? Speaking of which, he had lost the precious daughter of the Duke of Cruz, a genius alchemist and a viscount of the Empire. It was too late to hide, so why would he go looking for her? Was he looking for death? Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles was not surprised by Brando's reaction. Although he hated people from Cruz, he knew that most people from Cruz, especially nobles, were extremely proud and unyielding. They rarely backed down because of threats. Years ago, when Mephisto fought against the army in Cruz, most of the candidates who died in his hands were young. But even though they knew that they were no match for him, none of them fell with their backs facing him. That battle left a deep impression on Mephisto. Therefore, when he saw Brando today, he did not intend to let him speak first. The Ash Sword Saint snorted coldly. You don't want to talk? Then come with me. I believe Veronica will not leave a future genius like you alone. Although he did not see Brando's swordsmanship, the young man's commanding ability when fighting against the Winter Wolf was enough to be called a genius. Wait. Brando saw the Ash Sword Saint raise his giant sword without saying anything. His gray cloak fluttered and an invisible wind pressure came at him. He was going to attack directly. Brando could not help but feel his scalp tingle. His eyes narrowed and he quickly slid back like a ghost. Mephisto raised his sword to block Brando's escape route. With his ability he could easily capture Brando among these people. But he did not expect Brando to retreat so quickly. It was as if he knew what he was going to do. At this time Brando secretly sighed. When the Ash Sword Saint attacked, his in-depth analysis skill did not react at all. In the game this could only mean one thing: the Ash Sword Saint's skill level was too high. It had exceeded the limit of the current, in-depth analysis skill. However, in-depth analysis could more or less play a role in the fight with Veronica. Although the Kurlutzian Sword Saint did not use her full strength, the difference in strength between the two was obvious. In fact, Brando knew very well that the Ash Sword Saint might be slightly weaker than the Green Sword Saint Veronica in terms of absolute strength. But if they really fought, Veronica might not be a match for the Ash Sword Saint. Veronica's swordsmanship was at the peak of perfection. She could be considered as one of the top sword saints. However, the Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles was already an inhuman existence in the hearts of the players. If one had to give him a title, it would be the Sword God. Brando was able to dodge the attack purely because he had studied the Ash Sword Saint's attacking habits more than once when he completed the Black Iron Body quest. Moreover, he knew that the Ash Sword Saint would not defend himself if he wanted to capture him. With his experience and cleverness, he was able to dodge the attack before the Ash Sword Saint made his move. Otherwise, if the Ash Sword Saint was determined to slash Brando, not to mention his swordsmanship, just his sword aura alone would be enough to split Brando into two. Even so, he was only able to take one step back. After that, he would not be able to dodge the Ash Sword Saint's second strike. It was as if he knew what the Ash Sword Saint was going to do next. But his strength was limited and the gap between them was too big. Even if he knew what the Ash Sword Saint was going to do next, he could only watch as he was defeated. He took a step back and looked up to see Mephistopheles' calm expression. Mephistopheles swung his sword in the direction of his right hand, and a crescent-shaped sword aura shot out. But the strange thing was that the sword aura drew a perfect arc on the ground and whooshed towards Brendel's back as if it had eyes of its own. Secret art? Dragon Strike? In the past, countless players had died under this attack. Of course, Brando was no exception. Even after reaching level 130 as a warrior, he still could not master this technique. Forget about mastering it, he had never even heard of it. Other than the Ash Sword Saint's self-created secret art, the 20 forms, no one else knew this technique. Brando saw that the Ash Sword Saint was going to use his ultimate attack, but he could not do anything about it. At least, Brando did not think that he was tired of living. He could only stop for a moment. But the moment he stopped, the result was already decided. Mephistopheles seemed to have predicted Brendel's choice. He retracted his great sword and with a sudden thrust, he charged towards Brendel. Brendel swallowed the word, "wait," back into his stomach. The young lord felt a sense of suffocation in the face of such a powerful attack. This was the Ash Sword Saint's plan. In his opinion, Brando could only raise his sword to meet the Ash Sword Saint's attack. And in a battle where the weak was fighting against the strong, the Ash Sword Saint could not do anything. If the Ash Sword Saint was still suppressing the Ash Sword Saint, then the next attack would be the key to victory. Brendel was aware of this, but he had no other choice. His mind raced as he tried to find a way to resolve the worst-case scenario. It was at this moment that a voice that he was extremely familiar with suddenly sighed. It was the voice of the female knight. The Ash Sword Saint's aura made her feel threatened in her sleep, so she woke up early. As soon as she woke up, she immediately realized that Brando was in a very dangerous situation. "I've never seen his swordsmanship before, but he's pretty strong," Orthlis said as she stretched lazily. She saw Mephisto's sword coming towards her, and because of the quick exchange of thoughts she was able to ask calmly, "Little guy, how did you manage to get into trouble over there? Is this my own fault?" Brendel thought to himself. Is this my own fault? This was obviously his own trouble. Not only was the Ash Sword Saint a natural airhead, he was also a one-track mind. He did not even give Brendel a chance to speak before attacking. Is there still any justice in this world? However, Brando was not in the mood to pay attention to Orthlis's teasing. The great sword was about to pierce his chest, and he had no choice but to use Haoran Gaia to parry. P.S. I wrote 3 chapters today, but I'll release 2 chapters first. It's too scary to not have any chapters. I'll make up for it in the next 1 or 2 days. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 4:15. In fact, Brando wanted to use the White Raven sword art to prove himself, but he was powerless to do so. He could not help but feel powerless. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles was as terrifying as ever. He did not even give him a chance to fight back. Let's not talk about using the White Raven sword style. If I make any unnecessary movements, I'll probably be killed by her sword. Although Mephistopheles was determined to capture him alive, a battle of swordsmanship was not a joke. Both parties knew that the other party would go all out. If one of them tried to play around, he would be killed by the other party. That was not within Mephistopheles' expectations. After all, who would have thought that an opponent who was fighting with his life would play around with his own? Mephistopheles knew that Brando would have to use all his strength to block his attacks. That was the only way to limit the young man's movements. In fact, Brando had already surprised Mephistopheles. He was sure that this young man was a genius, and not just any genius. It was not that he was arrogant, but he had never seen a young man who could withstand 3 of his attacks. Not to mention a young man, even a grand swordsman who had been famous for a long time might not be able to withstand 3 of his attacks. After a round of battle, Mephistopheles had a rough idea of Brando's strength. But the more he thought about it, the more he was sure that Veronica would not give up on this young man so easily. Even in the Cruz Empire, it was rare for a young man in his early 20s to possess the strength of a gold. Moreover, he was also a genius in swordsmanship and battle tactics. Even Mephistopheles was secretly interested in this young man. But it was a pity that he was from the Cruz Empire. The genius of the Cruz Empire was his enemy. Mephistopheles' face was cold, but his sword moved faster. At this time, Brando heard Orthlis yawn sleepily and said, "Quick, little guy. Give me the control of this body. You can't defeat this guy. Is it okay?" Brando's mind was as fast as lightning. "There's a bit of a problem. You're definitely much weaker than him, but at least you're not completely helpless. I mean, is it okay to force it? Lady Orthlis, didn't you say that this is not the correct way to use the Holy Seal?" "Of course. I've rested for a month or 2 since the last time. 10 minutes or so shouldn't be a problem." Orthlis replied proudly. "What, are you looking down on me?" "That's not it, Lady Orthlis," Brando replied. After all, they were in the prime material plane. But when he thought about how Orthlis had saved his life in Bucci, he felt relieved. "You can do it." The exchange of thoughts between the two was completed in an instant. Mephisto's great sword had just collided with Brando's Haoran Gaia. But in reality, Brando was no longer in control of his body. In that instant, Orthlis struck out 3 times in a row. Haoran Gaia turned into a black shadow in her hand. Due to its speed, it looked like Haoran Gaia had split into 3 and collided with Mephisto's greatsword at the same time. Ding! The 3 sword strikes turned into a single metallic sound. Then, Orthlis took advantage of the momentum and retreated out of the range of the Ash Sword Saint's attack without taking any damage. At this time only a few seconds had passed since the start of the fight. There was a deathly stillness in the vicinity. The youths were dumbfounded, let alone the nobles from Erwin's diplomatic party. They seemed to have only just realized what they had seen. Was that young man really one of Erwin's men? Were the two of them still using mortal swordsmanship? Although the nobles were unbearable, they still had some ability to join the diplomatic party. Especially Robert, who was born in a prominent family, was naturally knowledgeable. He took a deep breath and immediately realized something. That young man was probably the most outstanding genius of Erwin in the last 3 centuries. He couldn't let him die in the hands of someone of unknown origin. Although Brando had called out the name of the Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles, there were many people with the same name in this world. Furthermore, the Ash Sword Saint had disappeared for so many years that it was normal for Robert to not recognize him. But at this moment he suddenly ran out and shouted, "Sir, wait, he's not Crew?" He wanted to prove that Brando wasn't one of Crew's men, but before he could finish his sentence, the Sword Saint who had rested his great sword on his shoulder interrupted him. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles raised his eyebrows and looked at Brando with interest. He didn't even look at the fat Robert who was yelling at the side. Instead he interrupted him and said to Brando, "What a good flash strike sword art, descendant of Gretel. Young man, Cruz's secret swordsmanship is now in your hands. What else do you have to say?" The jaws of Erwin's diplomatic party dropped to the ground when they heard Brendel's words. Robert stared at the young man with his mouth agape. His mind went blank for a moment. Cruz's secret swordsmanship, flash strike sword art, was passed down from the Dragon clan. It was much more famous than Erwin's White Raven swordsmanship, which was modified from the Wind Elf sword art. The White Raven swordsmanship might have been lost to the outside world, but flash strike sword art could only be practiced by Gretel's direct descendants. It was the Flame King swordsmanship, one of the pride of the Eagle Empire. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles and even the fat Erwin noble who fought alongside Brando from the Calamity of Wolves couldn't help but wonder if this young noble was really one of Cruz's men. Brando looked more like Erwin's men. But in fact, except for the blonde hair and blue eyes of the pure-blooded Eagle Knight's descendants, most Cruz's men and Erwin's men were very similar. After all, both of them were born from the same race centuries ago. Not to mention that Brando's mother was from Caliga, and his ancestors were exiled nobles from Cruz. Therefore it was hard for him to tell the difference. At this moment Robert suddenly realized something. No wonder this young man dared to teach the little princess of Flowerleaf a lesson so mercilessly. No wonder he dared to talk back to Veronica. No wonder he didn't put the lion beast men in his eyes. This young man was originally from Cruz, and not just any ordinary Cruz's men. He knew flash strike sword art, which meant that he was a direct descendant of the Flame King Gretel. Cruz was not like Erwin, where the Corvado dynasty replaced the Cipher dynasty. Because of the support of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was natural for the descendants of the Flame King to rule the empire. In summary, in other words, this young man was not only from Cruz, but also from the royal family of Cruz. When he thought of how they dared to provoke a member of the royal family of Cruz, Robert could not help but raise his chubby hand to wipe the sweat off his forehead. He paused for a moment and said hesitantly to Brando, "Sir Baron, please forgive us. We shouldn't have offended you." He did not dare to directly say that Brando was from Cruz to avoid the wrath of Mephisto. But in his opinion, Mephisto had already recognized Brando's identity, so it made no difference whether he said it or not. But as soon as he spoke, Orthless glanced at him in confusion. At this moment, Brando, who had just returned his soul to his body, almost vomited blood. Damn it, this time he would not be able to clear his name even if he jumped into the Yellow River. "Lady Orthless," he could not help but say. "You, what?" Orthless was slightly stunned. She was not an idiot. When she heard Mephisto's strange question and saw Robert's suspicious attitude, she naturally understood that she had done something stupid. But what she could not understand was that the Flame King Gretel's swordsmanship was a sage's swordsmanship. Could it be that the descendants of the Flame King had fallen to the point where everyone wanted to beat them up? But that did not seem to be the case. "Aren't you a wind elf? Why do you know how to use flash strike sword art?" Brando asked weakly. "Normally, people would use the swordsmanship they are most familiar with, right?" "That's true," Orthless replied, "but boy, this is your body now. Most of the swordsmanship I've trained in is suitable for females, and guilt swordsmanship is most suitable for you. That's why you can unleash 100% of its power." "In that situation just now, I could only use my full strength to protect myself," she replied in her mind. "Also, didn't you use flash strike sword art last time in the Arena of Destiny?" Brando almost vomited blood again. He thought that Orthless was an unexpected savior, but he did not know that this was the worst decision he had ever made. This was the worst decision he had ever made. But he also knew that the knight herself was not at fault. It was just that he could not think of such a coincidence even if he racked his brains. This is too much of a coincidence. But there was no point in saying anything now. Even Erwin's envoy had begun to doubt his identity. The centaurs and tree elves naturally did not have the ability to prove his identity. Only Coden, Amandina, and Scarlet knew that he was telling the truth. They had seen him use flash strike sword art in the underworld. But then again, could Coden, Amandina, and Scarlet really be sure? Brando knew that in their hearts he was also a mystery. Moreover, even if the two ladies were willing to testify, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles might not necessarily believe them. After all, in the eyes of this sword saint, they were on the same side as him. Brando glanced over. Scarlet seemed to want to walk over, but she was pulled back by Amandina. This action made Brando breathe a sigh of relief. He was really afraid that Scarlet would act rashly. Mephistopheles did not kill him because he still had some use for him. He might not be merciful to others. In fact, at this time, Brando understood that there was only one way left to prove his identity. And that was the silver brooch of the princess. A real member of the royal family of Cruz would not disguise himself as a knight of the royal family of Erwin. However, it was obviously not appropriate to display the silver brooch of the princess here. Brando looked around and said to Orthless, "Lady Orthless, do you have any tricks that can increase my speed?" "Of course, why?" Orthless replied while keeping her guard up against Mephistopheles. "Think of a way to lure him away from here. Lure him to a place where there's no one." Brando replied. "Boy, you're being too whimsical." Orthless shook her head. "His absolute strength is far greater than yours. I can only rely on my skills to make up for it for a while. There's no way I can escape, that's enough." "Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles' speed is his weakness," Brando said with certainty. "Even if it's not enough to shake him off, it's more than enough to lure him away." "Are you sure?" The knight was slightly surprised. Brando thought to himself that if he was not sure, he would not have been able to complete the Iron Body quest in the past. He nodded. "Listen to me, Lady Orthless. Go west from here and lure him to a place." Orthless hesitated for a moment, then nodded. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 416. You know you're no match for me, yet you still want to resist. Aren't you stupid? The Ash Sword Saint held the hilt of his sword with his right hand and rested the sword on his shoulder. He looked at Brendel and said. Orthless smiled. "Even though your swordsmanship is great, you're blind." Mephisto was slightly taken aback by the change in Brendel's tone, but the suspicion disappeared in a flash like a dragonfly. "Even so, you still want to say that you're not from Cruz? You'll find out soon enough." "What, you want to run?" Mephisto looked at him. Orthless. Brando smiled. Amandina. Amandina's voice was as soft as a strand of hair. "Yes. Follow this valley and head north. Wait for me at the White Rock." "White Rock. You'll find it when you see it." Amandina looked at her lord and nodded. She didn't ask any questions. Mephisto, who was standing not far away, looked at the conversation between the two. He loosened his grip on his sword for a moment, then tightened it again. With his perception, it wasn't impossible for him to catch the conversation, but he didn't think that Brando would be able to run far even if he wanted to. Moreover, his main target was Veronica. He just needed to make sure that Brando was under his control. Petty tricks. The Ash Sword Saint looked at the scene in silence. His pale and slender fingers loosened a little on the sword hilt. He told Orthless about the resting points in the game. Places like the Holy White Rock and the Holy Fountain in the Black Forest were the most stable places in the game. In other words, they were places that the game designers provided for the players to rest. There were 3 resting points in the Calamity of Wolves quest, and the closest one was not far away. Orthless and Amandina finished speaking and raised their swords. Mephisto looked at him, and asked, "Are you ready?" "You're very confident." This was Orthless' answer to her own question. Mephisto's arrogance had obviously provoked the pride of this ancient female knight as well. The Ash Sword Saint did not answer, but instead pointed his sword at Orthless. "Brando. Just give it a try." The meaning of this sentence is. Orthless snorted proudly and swung her sword downwards. 6 green streams of air appeared behind her like a pair of wings. This is. Mephisto's expression changed. This was the battle technique of the Wind Elves' Sky Patrol. Orthless took a small leap back and slid backwards like a ghost. Her speed was not fast, but it was an illusion. She left behind a series of afterimages as she slid backwards. In the eyes of the crowd, the young lord was still in front of them for a moment, but in the blink of an eye, he was already at the edge of the forest. The Ash Sword Saint snorted coldly. His body turned into a black dragon and chased after him. His speed was slightly slower, so this chase became a battle of endurance. Orthless changed direction at the edge of the forest and plunged into it. "What direction?" she asked. 1 or 2 miles should be enough." "That's a little far, little one." Orthless flapped her wings and glided through the tall trees. She turned around and saw Mephisto, who was holding his sword, was only a step behind her. The Ash Sword Saint was slow, but that was only in comparison. "If you can use that move to stop him, then it should be fine," she replied. "No, there's no other way. There are conditions to use the Holy Sword technique." Brando spent most of the day leading the crowd through the Thorn Ridge, but in fact he only used the first 2 hours to maintain the Holy Sword technique. His Earth Elemental pool had long been empty. The conversation between the two only lasted for a moment, but Mephisto had already launched his attack. He pushed his greatsword forward, and 3 sword auras shot out in a beautiful arc towards Orthless. The female knight dodged behind a tree and allowed the sword auras to hit the trunk of the tree. The sword auras pierced through the trunk like an axe, and the tree fell to the ground with a loud thud. Orthless hurriedly leaped away to avoid the branches that came crashing down. "Charge," Brando reminded her. "Idiot, in a battle of this level, a straight line will be predicted. Don't worry." The two continued to exchange ideas through divine sense. Mephisto was carefully listening to the wind and the grass around him. Orthless was hidden by the fallen trees, so he could not pinpoint her exact location. Suddenly a green shadow flashed by. The Ash Sword Saint's eyes twitched, and he instinctively drew his sword and swung it. A wind spirit spider that was pouncing towards him was cut in half. The wind elemental exploded in midair, and Orthless took advantage of that moment to rush out. Her timing was impeccable. Mephistopheles turned around sharply, but he could only catch a glimpse of Brendel's figure disappearing into the distance. So many tricks. Mephisto sheathed his sword and followed after Brendel. He was not afraid of falling into an ambush, but if Veronica was there, he would be able to deal with her as well. At this moment, the centaurs and tree elves who were far away in the valley could only hear a loud cracking sound from the forest, and then a large tree toppled over. They could only guess that there was a battle, but they did not know what exactly happened. Scarlet's knuckles turned white as she gripped her halberd tightly. "What do we do now, Miss Amandina?" The leader of the tree elves, Quinn, walked over and looked at the human girl. Brando's words clearly meant that he had given her the command. Amandina also looked away. "Follow the valley and wait for the Lord at the White Stone," she calmly replied. Quinn nodded and gestured for the others to continue forward. The leader of the tree elves maintained a cold expression, but he still looked at the forest in the end. The group slowly moved forward in the extremely quiet snowy landscape. For a moment, it seemed that the nobles of Erewhon were the only ones who had yet to react. After the loud explosion in the forest in the distance, all movement disappeared without a trace. The 2 figures disappeared in that direction and did not return. Scarlet stared blankly in that direction, her heart pounding with worry. For a moment, she was afraid that Mephistopheles would come back and throw Brendel's lifeless body in front of her. But after a while, when she saw that there was no movement, she felt a sense of loss. Scarlet frowned and sighed softly. She blamed herself for thinking about such bad things, but no matter what, she could not relax. "Scarlet? It's time to go." She raised her head and saw Amandina looking at her. Amandina was wearing a white fur dress as she stood in the wind and snow. Her round boots sunk into the thin layer of snow, and her quiet temperament seemed to be able to calm people down. "That's great, Amandina," Scarlet said with a tired expression. "If only I could be as strong as you." "I'm also worried," Amandina sighed, "but there's no point in worrying. Our Lord's orders have to be carried out." "That's why," Scarlet was a little dejected, "I really hate being so weak." Amandina did not reply. She was also uncertain in her heart. The group slowly moved forward, and the silence in the snow seemed to drown out the uneasiness in everyone's heart. While Amandina was immersed in her own worries, she suddenly heard a commotion at the back of the centaurs. Her frown deepened as she turned around and saw that the other half of the centaurs seemed to have stopped in their tracks. "What's going on?" Amandina turned her head and saw a group of centaurs coming out of the forest. Her expression changed when she saw the woman in the lead wearing a green cloak that swayed in the wind. She realized that too many things had happened and did not notice that the other groups were approaching. Especially when the snowstorm was getting heavier and heavier, perhaps no one would notice this at all. The newcomer was Veronica. The goddess of war from Cruz had chased after Brando all the way until they passed through the Wolf's Pass. She did not know that someone had beaten her to it, but her gaze swept over the centaurs and tree elves. She did not see Faina, Rono, Elman, or Brando, but she recognized Scarlet and Amandina. Veronica's slender fingers rested on the hilt of azure firmament as she took a step forward. With just one step, she seemed to have transcended the limits of time and space. It was as if she had turned into a gust of wind and crossed 100 meters in a single step. Amandina jumped in fright and subconsciously retreated, but the cold edge of the sword was already pressed against her white slender neck. Quinn had just raised his longbow, and Scarlet did not have time to raise the lightning spear in her hand. A moment ago, Veronica was at least 100 meters away. Amandina froze in place. The goddess of war looked down at the beautiful girl. Her long black hair and eyes were different from Erwin's bloodline. She was slightly startled, as if she had discovered something strange. But this doubt disappeared in an instant. Veronica had used all her strength in that attack, and it was within her expectations that Scarlet and Quinn couldn't react in time. Normally, she wouldn't do such a thing to a weak girl, but this time, the war goddess of the Empire was truly anxious. There was no news of Faina, Rono, or Elman. Especially Faina, the little princess of the Flowerleaf territory. She could not lose her no matter what. Lady Veronica, what are you doing? Quinn raised his longbow and aimed at the goddess of war. Coden also placed his hand on the hilt of his sword, ready to attack at a moment's notice. But Veronica did not even look at him and only asked, "You should have seen Cruz's envoy, right?" "I don't know." Amandina replied, "They left a long time ago. Didn't Brando kill them?" Of course, his lordship did not want to start a war. Veronica's expression changed. "When did they leave?" "My apologies, I cannot answer this question without his lordship's permission." Amandina's expression did not change. "Even if Lady Veronica kills me, it will still be the same." Veronica snorted and sheathed her sword. Threats were already her bottom line, and she would not kill anyone. Then where is his lordship? Amandina hesitated for a moment, but she suddenly made up her mind. "His lordship is not here right now." "Then bring me to him." Veronica was a little anxious and did not notice the slight change in Amandina's expression. "As a normal person, I can't keep up with you, Lady Veronica." "It's fine, let her come with me." Veronica turned around and looked at Scarlet. Scarlet was shocked and immediately took a step back. She raised her spear in front of her and looked at the goddess of war with extreme vigilance. The red-haired girl's body tensed up. If Veronica made any strange movements, she would immediately fight to the death. Scarlet's expression was clearly written on her face. She would rather die than reveal Brendel's whereabouts to anyone else. But Amandina stopped her. "Scarlet, don't do anything stupid." Scarlet was startled and looked at her in confusion. "Take Lady Veronica, take her to see the liege." The noble girl took a deep breath and said slowly, "This is my command." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 417. Orthlis was like a ghost as she passed through the forest, with the ash sword saint following from a distance. The two of them walked for a few minutes, but Orthlis suddenly frowned. She raised her head in a certain direction. The deeper they went into the forest, the more she smelled something she hadn't smelled in a long time. What's wrong?" Brando asked in his mind. "There's the smell of blood. It's so thick that it can't be dispersed. Are there any monsters nearby?" "The smell of blood? Let's go check it out." "This isn't the time to be nosy, little one." Brando didn't expect Orthlis to be so unfamiliar with the Black Forest. Monsters fed on magic. Even if they occasionally attacked other animals, there shouldn't be such a thick smell of blood. Brando was worried that the adventurers would be attacked, which meant that there might be unknown dangers lurking around. But it shouldn't be. Since the Flame King Gretel had the experience of trekking through the wilderness, the Wind Elves shouldn't have been any better. Or perhaps the Black Forest of this era was different from the past. He shook his head and said, "Let's go check it out, Miss Orthlis." Orthlis suddenly stopped. She narrowed her eyes and looked in that direction. Then she shot forward like an arrow. This sudden change in direction caused Mephisto, who was following closely behind, to frown slightly. He raised his vigilance slightly and followed behind. Orthless, Brando didn't pay much attention to the ash sword saint behind him. She passed through 3 tall trees covered in moss. The smell of blood in the air was getting thicker and thicker. Then she suddenly stopped. The forest in the valley suddenly opened up in front of them. There was a small open space in front of them, but the scene in the open space was too horrible to look at. The grassland seemed to have been smeared with a layer of blood. There were human limbs and blood-soaked organs everywhere. Corpses were spread from one end to the other. There were at least 100 or 200 corpses stacked on top of each other. There was even a thin layer of snow on top of each other. However, the white snow was also soaked with crimson blood. Both Orthless and Brendel gasped at the same time. Even though Orthless was used to fighting and killing, she had not seen such a fierce battle in the past few centuries. The air was filled with the thick, nauseating smell of blood. They're from the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Brando recognized them at a glance. Almost all of them were wiped out. He confirmed this when he saw the corpses of 2 low-level priests under the layers of corpses. At least 2 priests had died in a single battle. This was a serious matter. In fact, the clergy of the Holy Cathedral of Fire were divided into 3 categories. The first category was the high priests of each country. There were a total of 11 of them, and it could be said that the Holy Cathedral of Fire was the core of the Holy Cathedral of Fire's power. Then came the high priests, and lower priests of each region. These people belonged to different factions and were the backbone of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. In order to truly become an existence of this level in the Holy Cathedral, in addition to having a firm belief in the golden fire that the Holy Cathedral of Fire served, one must at least possess the strength of a gold rank. The lower priests were the same as the reserve knight of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but their status was much higher. Because they were few in number, the loss of one was a great loss to the Holy Cathedral. Therefore, every lower priest should have at least 3 reserve knight of the Holy Cathedral to protect them. In other words, there were at least 8 gold ranks among the corpses here. Brendel sucked in a breath of cold air, not because of the strength of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but because he was wondering what kind of trouble these guys had gotten themselves into, for such a powerful team to end up in such a miserable state. He immediately recalled the corpses of the Holy Cathedral of Fire's subordinates that he had discovered a few hours ago. He frowned deeply. This boss was a little too ridiculously strong. At this time, Orthless heard a noise behind her. She turned around and saw the Ash Sword Saint walking out of the forest with a giant sword on his shoulder. He was stepping on the dried twigs on the ground, making a cracking sound. Mephistopheles chased after Brando and thought that he had led him into a trap. But when he saw the tragic scene in front of him, he could not help but be stunned. He frowned and asked, "What's going on?" He must have been attacked by demons. "Humph, Cruz's lackey, you deserve it," the Ash Sword Saint said indifferently. At this moment, the two of them did not seem to be talking to each other like enemies. The gray-haired man took out his sword and pointed it at Brando. "Well, since you know you can't escape, come with me obediently." Orthless was stunned. She thought that this guy was really stubborn. But when she was about to take out the brooch that the Regent Princess gave to Brando, she suddenly heard Brando say to her in her mind, "Something is coming from the west, Lady Orthless." The knight raised her eyebrows. "How did you know?" "My wind spirit spiders are disappearing. It's coming." The wind spirit spiders had disappeared without a trace. Brendel's tone became urgent. He felt that the wind spirit spiders were most likely the boss. "Wait, something is coming from the east." Mephistopheles' tone suddenly changed. Orthless's heart skipped a beat. "You mean there are 2 monsters?" "It's hard to say, but no matter what, we should leave this place as soon as possible," Brando reminded her. "But little one, if we retreat now, that monster will definitely attack." Orthless looked at Mephistopheles. "At such a close distance, I don't have the confidence to rush out." "You're too weak. You won't be able to use Sky Patrol a second time in a short period of time." This was the first time Brando was judged as weak. He was only in his early 20s, and it was already a miracle that he had the strength of a gold-ranked monster. What else could she expect? However, he knew that there was no point in arguing with this 1,000-year-old woman. In her eyes he was indeed weak. He shook his head. "Let's exchange bodies. Let me explain." Orthless did not object and immediately retracted her consciousness into the space ring. Brando's consciousness took over control of the ring. In the eyes of the Mephistopheles, Brando was stunned for a moment before his eyes regained their clarity. "Something is coming. You don't want to know what killed these people, do you?" Brendel asked, raising his head to look at him. His first words were alarmist. Mephistopheles paused for a moment and was about to say something when he saw the young man take out a silver brooch from his chest. However, before he could see what the brooch was, a rustling sound was heard from the bushes beside him. Two people came out of the bushes. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles. Veronica. When Mephistopheles saw who it was, he and the woman immediately took a step back vigilantly and pointed their swords at each other. "My lord." It was Scarlet's voice. Brando looked up and his hand froze in midair. He could not help but grumble in his heart. So it was this old woman from the Empire who came from the east. Why did she come here again? And she even brought Scarlet with her. Isn't this making things worse? But risk often comes with opportunity. Brando quickly noticed that the moment Veronica and Mephistopheles discovered each other's presence, they were completely focused on each other. It was as if they had completely forgotten about the existence of others. Come to think of it, in a confrontation at their level, any carelessness could cost a person's life. However, the tense atmosphere between the two sides was a good opportunity for Brando. He took a deep breath and quickly gestured to Scarlet, who was standing beside Veronica, to quickly come to his side. Brando sensed that the number of wind elves in the west was rapidly decreasing. He was afraid that the boss would rush out of the forest. He did not care if Veronica and Mephistopheles lived or died, but he was no longer a player who would lose a level if he died. If he was targeted by the boss, he would not even have a place to cry. At this time, Veronica's attention was not on Scarlet at all. Of course, the red-haired girl also noticed this. In fact, when she saw Brando, she could not help but want to run over. She was worried that Brando would blame her for bringing Veronica here. But when she saw that Brando did not seem to mind, the rock in her heart finally fell to the ground. She let out a sigh of relief and carefully walked to Brendel's side, looking at her lord with some peace of mind. But what she did not expect was that before she could stand still, Brando grabbed her hand and said, "Quick, follow me." "What's wrong?" "Nothing." Even in the midst of the snow, Scarlet felt as if there was a stream of heat flowing from his hand all the way to her heart and face, causing her cheeks to burn as if they were on fire. But she lowered her head and pretended to be calm. Brando nodded. He first looked back at the west, then at Veronica and Mephistopheles who were confronting each other. Then he looked around and found the direction he came from and ran in that direction. Scarlet followed behind him and held her breath. She was at a loss as to what to do as the lord she admired pulled her and ran. Her mind was blank. She felt like a marionette that was being pulled by Brando in a certain direction. She did not know the direction, but she felt like she would die if she made a sound. Scarlet could hear her heart thumping hard. But Brendel did not notice Scarlet's strange behavior. Even though he felt that her actions were a little strange, his concern for the thing behind him suppressed his suspicions. Furthermore, he did not have the fire seed with him. He had given it to Amandina before he left, and the two of them were gold rankers. Without the fire seed, they could only last for a few hours in the frost. They had to return to the White Stone as soon as possible. But at this time, Brando suddenly heard the wind elf Orthlus's warning, "Be careful, there's something coming from behind." Then Brando heard a sharp whistling sound behind his head. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 418. Brando quickly formed an intuitive concept in his mind. If it was like the sonic boom of a whip, then Brando could not imagine how big the whip was. To be exact, it was a whip that swept through the entire forest. The terrible sonic boom swept through the entire forest in an instant. Brando felt numb at the back of his head. He subconsciously pulled Scarlet forward and the two rolled into a nearby tree hole. Then there was a buzzing sound that seemed to sweep through his brain, causing his eardrums to resonate. A few seconds later, he even felt that there was a buzzing sound in his head that lasted for a long time. Only after a long time did he gradually recover his hearing. That was really terrifying. At the last moment before he fell into the tree hole, he saw a whizzing attack. It was a whip-shaped air wall about the height of a tree trunk. It was a vast expanse of whiteness, and it swept across half of the valley in an instant. The moment he fell into the tree hole, the wall of air just swept over his head. Brando could not help but shake his head in the darkness of the tree hole. The impact from before seemed to have caused his teeth to cut his lips, and his mouth was full of the taste of blood. But he immediately froze because he felt a soft response on his lips. If it was not for the faint scent of the girl in the darkness, he would have almost forgotten that he was still under Scarlet. Brando's face turned red. His vision gradually adapted to the dark environment in the tree hole where even the stars were weak. He gradually saw that his hands were on the wet soil in the tree hole. And coincidentally, Scarlet was under him, facing him with her mouth slightly open like a frightened little animal. The girl's burning amber eyes were particularly bright in the darkness. But it was not anger that burned but shyness. She almost forgot to breathe. There was blood on both of their lips, and there was a salty taste of blood in each other's mouths. Brando's face was stiff and he did not say a word. He sat up and stretched out his hand stiffly to pull Scarlet up. Although he had restrained himself from thinking about what happened before, he did not know why that memory was so fresh and vivid. His lips responded with the soft fragrance of a young girl, with a touch of the wildness of fresh blood, as if it could melt his thoughts. It was clearly something that happened in an instant, but it played out in his memory over and over again. It was as if he had lived in that moment forever. Neither of them spoke. Brando couldn't help but want to cover his face. This was the first kiss of a failed magician in his previous life and even in this life. How could he lose it so inexplicably and humiliatingly? He could not help but comfort himself that perhaps the kiss on the little Roman's forehead was his first kiss, but even he could not come up with such an excuse. It was also Kuqian's first time. The red-haired girl felt that she was going to melt into a water-like substance that seeped into the cold soil beneath her body. She stared blankly with her eyes wide open until Brando pulled her up. "So sorry," the two of them said in unison. Scarlet let out an ah and lowered her head. Brando felt that his face was burning. It was as if the danger outside the forest had disappeared, or he had completely forgotten about it. Although he had decades of experience in his two lives, he was not prepared for this at all. Then Orthless laughed out loud. Her laughter was like a silver bell in the dark, waking Brando up. "Little one, you are so cute." Ahem. Brando coughed. "What was that just now? Did you see it clearly, Miss Orthless?" Orthless seemed to have discovered a new continent, but she was not in a hurry to press on. Instead, she replied, "It looked like the tail of something. I don't think I saw it wrong." "Tail?" The word was like a bucket of cold water that drenched Brando from head to toe. What kind of creature could have such a big tail? He was suddenly startled, and suddenly remembered that the previous attack really did seem like a dragon's tail sweep attack. But if it really was a tail attack, oh Martha, how big was that dragon? Wait, it didn't have a physical body? Brando suddenly took a deep breath and asked. "It seemed to be a creature of the air element," Orthless replied, "but I could barely make out that it was some kind of cloud or mist." "It was a monster." Brando corrected her. He turned around and called out, "Scarlet." Scarlet also reacted at this time, although her face was still red. "I know, my lord." "Wait." The girl was suddenly startled. "My gun is still outside." She looked up and saw that Brando had already climbed up the tree hole. Brando thought that Mephisto and Veronica should still be in the open space. But the two of them should not have been killed in an instant. Although it was not impossible, it was still a little inconceivable that two of the most powerful people in history would die in front of him. Even if he was here to change history. But this was a little too inexplicable. Brando climbed out of the tree hole and saw that Scarlet's spear of lightning was still not far away. But when he saw the scene outside, his face immediately changed and he shrank back into the tree hole. Scarlet saw the strange expression on her lord's face and his forehead was full of cold sweat. "What's wrong?" she asked. Brando quickly put a finger to his lips and motioned her not to make a sound. "What is that?" He could not help but ask Orthless in his mind. "Even if you ask, I don't know, little one." Orthless also took a deep breath. Although there were many strange monsters in the dark forest, the thing outside was too outrageous. "It looks like," she thought for a moment and found a reliable word, 10-15 serpentine lizards. But Brando waited for a while, and when he was sure that the thing did not notice him, he poked his head out and carefully looked at it. If the first time he was shocked, then the second time he confirmed that it was not an illusion. Even Brando could not help but feel a sense of insignificance from the depths of his heart. He felt that his limbs were a little weak. He raised his head and looked at the behemoth that stood on the ground. Above the forest. Above the layers of clouds. Behind the layers of clouds, there were 15 gigantic white dragon heads that were formed from clouds and mist. They were looking around slowly. It stood on top of the forest. The dark green treetops were like a layer of carpet at its feet. The gigantic beast looked more like a white mountain range. It was a mountain range made of clouds. Brando could not help but think of the thick cumulonimbus clouds in the sky in the past. And this thing was a little bit like those unpredictable clouds. It occupied half the sky in the forest. Brando looked at the giant beast and felt that it was a little difficult to breathe. Was this thing really supposed to appear in this quest? Why did it look like a level 1 creature with a perfect body? A mythical creature. Brando. Orthlus's voice came from his heart. Yes. This thing looks like a Saint Hydra? Ancestral mythical beast? Shouldn't ancestral mythical beasts be physical creatures? Brando felt that his mouth was a little dry. Probably a projection. Orthlus was not sure. After all, creatures like the Leviathan, the Ouroboros Jormungand, and the Saint Hydra were just legends even a dozen centuries ago. Even if it's just a projection, it's enough to kill people, Brando thought. Wait, Brando. The knight suddenly said. What's wrong? The forest seems to be foggy. Foggy? Brando was startled. He looked around and saw that the fog was rising little by little. At first, Brando thought that it was snow, but after a while he realized that the wind and snow had stopped. It was just that there was a strange silence in the forest. There was no mention of ancestral mythical beasts having the ability to control fog. Brendel subconsciously raised his head. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he immediately saw the huge wall of clouds in the sky slowly moving forward, and wherever it passed, lightning flashed and thunder rumbled above the dark mountains and forests between the heavens and the earth. In the darkness, the pillars of light that represented civilization and order were flickering and then extinguishing one by one. It was like a candle flame that was blown out in a storm. The wall of clouds is closing again. Brando felt his eyelids twitching. At the same time, Karglais, who was hiding under the white sacred stone, sat next to Medea, holding the priestess' hand tightly. He stared at the terrifying scene with his mouth agape. Dozens of pillars of light in the southern sky were extinguished at the same time. One after another, the pillars of light flickered and then suddenly disappeared. The disappearance of each pillar of light was not only the end of a life, but also the end of a hope in the darkness. No one said a word. Amandina sat on the other side of the bonfire. She raised her head, and the light in her dark eyes disappeared bit by bit. The air was cold to the bone, and she hugged her knees as if it was the only way to bring some warmth to herself. Her lord was gone and Scarlet was taken away. The sudden change in the sky made her feel extremely uneasy. But she could not show her uneasiness. She subconsciously gripped her skirt tightly, and her pale and slender fingers reflected her true feelings. Falerne sat by her side, remaining silent as always. Only then did the noble lady feel a little more at ease. She took a deep breath and looked to the other side. When Veronica left, she left some people to monitor them. There were about 100 of Cruz's envoys. It was not impossible for Quinn's tree elves and the remaining centaurs to resist, but Amandina did not agree to it. After all, they had to wait for Brando to return. Amandina looked at the leader of the Cruz's envoys, a countess. She was only slightly older than Amandina, but her beauty was enough to make anyone jealous. Her face seemed to blend the smoothness and perfection of a classical goddess statue. She stood there quietly, neatly dressed in a thick black and purple woolen coat. Her long violet hair was draped over her shoulders. She was full of mystery and elegance. However, Amandina found some similarities between her and him. They were both calm and rational, but their slightly furrowed brows reflected the true thoughts in their hearts. She's worried. Amandina was slightly distracted. She raised her head and looked at the sky. What is she worried about? Or is this strange omen foretelling something? Delphian did not notice Amandina's gaze. She only looked at the fog that was getting thicker and thicker. She muttered to herself, "The light has been extinguished. Is this the demonic wave? Elman, where are you? P.S. What the hell is wrong with Chidian's author section? Can't they have some integrity? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the legal reading." Chapter 420. The closing of the wall of clouds meant that the mana was flowing back, and the effects of the great tide were becoming more and more apparent. Brando looked up at the Saint Hydra that occupied half the sky above the mountains. For a moment he had difficulty breathing. Even if it was just a projection, it was still at least level 100. Neither he nor Orthlus spoke. They were both thinking of a way to get through this ordeal. Brando looked around and saw a large boulder not far away. He calmed down a little and began to consider the possibility of hiding from the Saint Hydra. He took a deep breath to adjust his breathing and gave himself a pep talk. There were more dangerous situations than this in the game, and there was no reason to be afraid just because there was only one chance. For example, the raid on Fort Narulisai in Madara, and the battle at the Dragon's Lair. As long as every step is perfect, Brando thought back to his past experiences and felt confidence returning to him. The adventurous nature in Sophie's blood was ignited. He took another deep breath and reached out his hand to grab the tree roots and tried to crawl out of the hole. Under the cover of the tree canopy, he could only hope that he could hide from the Saint Hydra's sight. Brando stuck close to the ground and prepared to crawl out bit by bit along the roots of the tree. Little guy. Orthlis was stunned. She did not expect Brando to be so daring. Hiding here is not a solution. That thing won't leave anytime soon. It seems to have noticed something, Brando said in his mind. I suspect that the Ash Sword Saint and Veronica are still alive. What are you going to do? Orthlis asked in her mind, but due to the surrounding environment she subconsciously lowered her voice. I'll go behind the boulder first. Then I'll see if I can use the environment to get out of here. As long as I'm 3 or 4 miles away, the Saint Hydra should not be able to see what's going on in the forest. That's quite a distance. Are you that confident? Orthlis looked at Brando but she did not ask. She knew that since Brando had already made up his mind, he must have such determination. She could see this from the flames of adventure burning in the young lord's eyes. This kind of Brando was beyond Orthlis' understanding, but she liked him much more than the steady and rational Brando. Brando did not say a word and carefully climbed out of the tree hole. He was like a lizard in the mud lying on the ground. He didn't even dare to breathe loudly. Sometimes he even felt like there was a dagger at his back. Although the weather was cold and dry, sweat still dripped down from his forehead. It took Brando several minutes to climb out of the tree hole, and then it took another minute to turn around. When he had done all this, he remained motionless, feeling his heart beating hollow and strong, one beat after another, thumping. Brando waited for about half a minute, but the Saint Hydra in the valley did not seem to notice him. He let out a sigh of relief and reached out to Scarlet, who was under the tree hole. Come up, Scarlet. Scarlet stood in the tree hole, not knowing what was happening above. She could only anxiously wait for Brando's news. She looked up and saw Brando extending his hand to her. She was startled for a moment before she put her hand in Brando's hand. Scarlet, no matter what you see later, don't make a sound. Brando held her hand and reminded her sternly. He trusted this red-haired girl, but it was better to be safe than sorry. Scarlet nodded firmly. Brando then pulled her out of the tree hole. The girl was shocked when she saw the terrifying figure of the Saint Hydra, but she did not make a sound as she promised. Brando gave her a thumbs up as a sign of appreciation. But this was only the beginning of a successful plan. Then he carefully climbed out of the tree hole with Scarlet. Crouching like a cat, he used the intertwining protruding roots between the tall trees to get closer to the rock. The distance between the tree hole and the rock was only 23 meters. In the past, this distance was just a blink of an eye for them, but now it felt like a century had passed. The Saint Hydra stood in the valley and slowly turned around. Its huge tail swept across the top of their heads more than once, causing them to break out in cold sweat. When the two of them merged into the shadow behind the huge rock, they felt like they had lost all their strength. Scarlet was fine, but Brando felt like his back was drenched in sweat. He let out a long sigh and began to plan his next move. His gaze passed through the shadows of the trees. Fortunately, there were not many open spaces in the dark forest. He was planning to enter the valley on the north side of the ridge. If he could get there, he would be able to avoid the Saint Hydra's gaze. The distance was less than 2 miles, half of what he had expected. But there was a problem in the middle. They had to cross a small stream that crossed the valley. If the shrubs on both sides of the stream were not enough to provide cover, it would be very dangerous. But after weighing the pros and cons, he decided to do it. It was not a good habit to be indecisive on the battlefield. A good warrior must have confidence in himself. If he did not believe he could do it, then he would not be able to do it. And Brando happened to be one of the best warriors among the players. He and Scarlet rested for about a minute behind the rock. During this time, the Saint Hydra slowly moved along the valley. It seemed to be looking for something, its 15 heads swaying in the air. The two of them did not dare to make a sound. Brando silently counted to 50 seconds before he signaled to the red-haired girl beside him. The two of them then rushed out like lightning. They landed in the shadow of a huge oak tree and held their breath, as if waiting for the judgment of fate. But the Saint Hydra still did not pay attention to them. The White Mountain was already halfway into the valley. Its movement seemed slow and clumsy, but Brando knew that it was an illusion. If one could cross hundreds of meters in a single step, one would know that slow was only a relative term. Brando's next target was the goose-eared stalagmite forest by the river. The dense foliage of the stalagmite was the best cover for hunters in the mountains, and it was no exception to this rule. They followed the forest to the riverside without making a sound. Scarlet accidentally stepped on a dead branch and snapped it. When the crisp crackling sound rang out, the two of them looked like they were struck by lightning. But fortunately, Luck was on their side this time. The Saint Hydra seemed to have noticed something on the other side of the valley. It raised its 15 heads and roared in unison before it slowly turned around. The white tail of the Saint Hydra swept across the forest again. Was it Veronica or Mephisto? Brendel did not know, but he could only wish her good luck. At the same time he seized the opportunity and rushed forward. Scarlet followed closely behind, and the two of them quickly passed through the tall bushes at the edge of the forest. The bushes extended all the way to the exposed pebbles near the valley. The stream was only a few dozen feet away. Both of them were panting a little. Even though they had only run a little more than a mile and with their stamina they should not feel tired at all. However, the high tension was causing their stamina to deplete at an accelerated rate. Both of them felt a little overwhelmed. The distance between them and the Lernea Hydra was about 2,000 to 3,000 meters away from them in a straight line. It's about 2,000 to 3,000 meters away from the Lernea Hydra. It sounded like a long distance, but it was only a few steps for a mythical creature. The tail of the Saint Hydra was probably 1,000 meters long. There was no way to fight it. In Brando's memory, the only creature that could rival it was the evil dragon, whose nest alone was hundreds of miles in diameter. He patted his face as he recovered from the tragic hunting experience known as the Battle of the Dragon's Nest. The Saint Hydra was attacking something on the other side of the valley. Its 15 heads pierced through the clouds and occasionally swooped down on targets 1,000 meters below. Brando was puzzled. Veronica and Mephisto could not have run so far in an instant. Was there someone else? With that in mind, he turned around and was about to step out of the bush. But at that moment, Brando suddenly felt a strong force coming from the left. He felt a grip on his shoulder. He immediately realized that there was someone else in the bush, but his reaction was too slow. The force had already grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him back. "My lord!" Scarlet saw a hand reaching out from the bush and pulling Brando in. She was startled and instinctively pulled out the dagger in her boot. But she immediately saw a familiar face. Veronica held Brendel with one hand and held the sword against Scarlet's chest with the other. Lady Veronica? Brando was shocked when he saw the person who grabbed him. He did not forget that he had lost the 3 important people of the Cruz Empire. He knew better than anyone that at least 2 of the 3 had been killed by the Lord of Withering Flowers. Shu, the goddess of war, had a serious look on her face. She looked up and said to the 2 of them, "Don't make a sound if you want to live." Brando was stunned at first, but he suddenly realized something. He looked up and followed Veronica's gaze. He saw that the Saint Hydra was attacking its target on the other side of the valley, but the fog around its body was slowly spreading out and shrouding the sky above the forest. Fog. Brendel was shocked. He originally thought that the fog was just a projection of the ancestral god beast, but now it seemed that this was not the case at all. Veronica's reminder made him realize that it was not the ancestor beast, but the fog in the valley itself. This was what the druids encountered. Brando immediately connected the dots. He lowered his head and looked at Veronica. He knew that she had saved his life. If the fog was part of the Saint Hydra, then the whole valley should be under its surveillance. As soon as he left the dense forest, he would be immediately captured. But why did Veronica save him? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 421. Brando's shock lasted until he heard a soft ding. He snapped out of his stupor and saw the Cruz goddess of war hit the dagger out of Scarlet's hand. The dagger fell into the bushes. The red-haired girl raised her head and held her right wrist with one hand. She gritted her teeth and glared at the old woman without saying a word. This was the second time she had suffered at the hands of the old woman, and the old woman's condescending attitude made her very uncomfortable. If not for the fact that her lord was still in her hands, she would have glared at Veronica with hatred. But Veronica did not say a word either. She dragged Brando into the bushes, not caring if Scarlet was still following behind them. "Lady Veronica, it's not very polite of you to do this." Brendel's shoulder was gripped by a hand, and it felt like he was being clamped by a pair of steel pliers. He could not move his body at all. Even though it was quite a unique experience to be dragged by the war goddess of the empire in the grass. If someone was intimately touched by Veronica in the game, they would definitely post about it on the forums. But Brando did not think that it was something to brag about. Veronica continued to drag him deeper into the bushes as if she did not hear him. She then turned around and said coldly, "Mr. Brando, manners can only be talked about if you survive on the battlefield." Veronica let go of him, and Brando immediately felt that he had regained control of his body. He took a deep breath and grimaced as he rubbed his shoulders. He thought to himself, this old woman is really strong. All right, where are Vahina and the others? Veronica asked. Lady Faina and Sir Elman left when the calamity of wolves began. Brendel's expression did not change. It was not entirely a lie if the calamity of wolves began within an hour of the Black Wolves' attack at the Wall of Roses. Veronica looked at Brando and did not say a word. She put one of her hands under her cloak. This subtle movement did not escape Brando's eyes. He thought that she must be holding something like the gem of lie detection. If it were an ordinary person, it would be easy for them to overlook these inconspicuous details. However, for the experienced players of the game, these kinds of tricks were nothing new. You didn't kill them? Veronica frowned and asked. Brando took a deep breath. He finally confirmed the reason why Veronica attacked. She was here for Vahina. This meant that she had not encountered the Lord of Withering. He looked above him. The fog was slowly spreading over the forest, which meant that the valley would soon become unsafe. Why would I kill them? I have no reason to start a war. Brando looked away. He had calmed down and looked at Veronica with his deep brown eyes. Veronica heaved a sigh of relief, but for some reason she suddenly thought of the noble girl who came from Aween. The master and servant's answers were the same, and she could not help but shake her head. Can you bring me to them, Mr. Brando? I'm afraid that's impossible. Brando flatly refused. Vahina had already been taken away by the Lord of Withering. Rono and Elman were also dead, and there was no way to find them. No one knew this better than him. Moreover, he had a more important mission to complete, and he could not afford to waste time looking for them. You know very well, Lady Veronica, Brando replied, I am not responsible for the disappearance of Viscount Elman and Miss Vahina. Veronica did not comment on this answer. She just stared at Brando as if she wanted to read his true intentions. The atmosphere was a little heavy. At this moment, there was a soft rustling sound from the bushes. Scarlet parted the bushes and saw Brando and Veronica confronting each other. She was stunned for a moment and wanted to go to Brando's side. However, Scarlet didn't expect that the moment she moved, a cold sword was placed across her throat. Veronica pressed her sword against Scarlet's snow-white neck. What is the meaning of this? Brando's eyes widened as he looked at Veronica in disbelief. I'm sorry, young man. If you don't agree, I'm afraid I'll have to take your companions away. Is this a threat? Brando took a deep breath. The goddess of war of the Empire was known for her righteousness and integrity, and she had a relationship with the goddess of war, Freya. He did not expect that there would be a day where she would use her sword to threaten two of her juniors. Brendel looked at Veronica's cold face and realized that he had underestimated the importance of the Flower Leaf Territory's little princess to the goddess of war. Lady Veronica, as you can see, the demonic wave that appeared in the forest is currently invading this area. The Druids have asked me to head to the center of the Loop of Trade Winds to restore order and prevent the Green Tower from being destroyed by the wolves. As a descendant of the Flame King, you should know the consequences if the demonic wave goes out of control. What does that have to do with me? I'm a noble of the Empire, not a saint who saves the world. Veronica raised an eyebrow. Her voice was filled with the dignity of a commander. But you don't want to give up on saving the lives of others for one person, do you? Brando looked at Veronica and said, Perhaps Lady Vahina is the only successor of the Duke of Flowerleaf, but her life is not more important than the others here. You're right, Veronica sighed and shook her head, but it's meaningless. You should know who I am. She grabbed Scarlet's shoulder, causing the girl to frown in pain. Then I'm sorry. Since you don't want to, I'll have to take your companions away so that you can follow me. Forgive me for not being able to comply, Brando replied in a deep voice. Brando was already dissatisfied with Greysword St. Mephistopheles' sudden appearance, and Veronica's unreasonable attitude ignited the flames of anger in his heart. Since the negotiations had broken down, there was no need for him to hold back any longer. He lowered his head, and the Haurangaya in his hand drew a dark sword light towards Veronica. In front of Veronica, who was far stronger than him, he had to make the first move to gain the upper hand. However, Veronica was not surprised by Brando's decisiveness. After the battle in the Centaur Bazaar, she knew that this young man would not give in so easily. Brando's attack was within her expectations. You overestimate yourself. The Empire's goddess of war snorted and casually swung her sword towards Brando's Haurangaya. In Brendel's eyes, this casual slash was more like a sword screen. He did not think too much about it, and directly pushed himself off the ground with his hand, and shot towards Veronica while sticking close to the ground. His sword changed direction and slashed towards Veronica's feet. His goal was not to cripple the Empire's goddess of war, but to force her to retreat so that Veronica could release Scarlet. Veronica was surprised by Brando's reaction. She had already used the Azure Sword Saint's inheritance, Sword Veil, but she did not expect Brando to be able to predict her attack. Just how talented was this little fellow in swordsmanship? It was too late to change her attack, so Veronica had no choice but to let go of Scarlet and retreat. However, she still had to make Brando pay the price. As she retreated, she swung her sword at Brando's blade. Clang! The two swords clashed with each other as if they were real. At that moment, Brando felt that it was not a sword aura that was clashing with him, but a dragon. The power of Veronica's sword aura was almost unstoppable, and before he could react, his whole body was swept away like a cannonball. Brando crashed into the sand with a bang, feeling dizzy for a moment. However, he was not surprised by this result. He immediately got up and saw Scarlet roll away from Veronica's hand. Unfortunately, although the red-haired girl's reaction was fast, it was still too slow compared to Veronica's speed. The Sword Saint retreated and immediately tried to catch the escaping Scarlet. She took a step forward and arrived behind Scarlet. Scarlet gritted her teeth and tried to resist, but Veronica did not even look at the dagger in her hand. She then grabbed Scarlet's shoulder. Brando naturally would not let her have her way. The young lord did not hesitate and threw the Howran Gaia in his hand at Veronica. The Howran Gaia drew a straight line in the air, and a row of spikes protruded from the ground and pierced towards Veronica. Veronica frowned and could only take a step back to avoid the sharp edge of the Howran Gaia. The Howran Gaia flashed in front of her with its spikes. But when she stopped, she did not expect Brando to form a sword with his hand and create a whirlwind with the White Raven Sword aura. The White Raven Sword aura struck the Howran Gaia and pulled it back from the air. The Howran Gaia changed direction in the air and stabbed towards Veronica again. The goddess of war of the Empire was shocked. She did not expect the Howran Gaia to have a second attack. Although the Howran Gaia had lost its aim, the Howran Gaia's rock spikes were not lacking in offensive power. Veronica had no choice but to stop and deflect the Howran Gaia. Brando used the White Raven Sword aura to regain control of the Howran Gaia. The Howran Gaia drew an arc in the air and landed in his hand. When Brando caught the sword, he could not help but let out a sigh of relief. The double attack of throwing the Howran Gaia was a stroke of genius. Even he did not expect it to work. But if he had to use a word to describe his current mood, it would be too cool. He was stunned when he held the Howran Gaia. Little one, this is not the White Raven Sword aura. This technique is almost the same as the original. Orthlis's voice immediately rang in his mind. She could not help but sigh. If I did not know that you have never learned the Wind Elf's secret sword, I would have doubted your origin. But your talent in swordsmanship is too amazing. It's unbelievable. Brando did not respond to the knight's words. He raised his head and looked at Veronica. The goddess of war of the Empire was forced to stop, and Scarlet had already escaped from her hands. The red-haired girl was almost at Brando's side. Although there was not much distance between them to begin with. But Brando knew that this was enough. At this moment, Veronica withdrew her sword with a cold expression. When she saw the young man's expression of relief, her expression suddenly changed as she thought of something. The goddess of war of the Empire turned around. She immediately held her breath and saw the 15 terrifying heads of the Hydra circling above them. Brando was sent flying and was half kneeling in the grass. Because of Brando's Howran Gaia, there was an empty space around her. She was standing in the middle of the empty space. It was obvious who was more conspicuous. Damn it, I was tricked by this kid. Veronica realized this in her heart. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 422. Veronica looked up. Her blue eyes reflected the 15 heads of the Saint Hydra in the dark sky. Even someone as powerful as the goddess of war couldn't help but hold her breath. The giant beast caught the slightest movement on the other side of the forest from above the clouds. Its crimson eyes saw the tiny human, but after the 15 heads circled around him in a snake-like formation, only the 7th head remained. The giant serpent head lifted high and turned into a cloud in mid-air. The attack from the cloud came one after another. Thousands of air arrows shot out, aiming for Veronica below. But Brando knew this was bad. The monster's attack area was too large. It covered a radius of 1,000 feet, almost covering the entire forest. Thousands of white air arrows pierced the forest at the same time. It was a terrifying yet beautiful scene to the bystanders, but to the people in the middle of it, it was a breathtaking scene. Brendel's position was no exception, but he decisively rolled to the side. Immediately, more than 10 air arrows as thick as buckets hit the spot where he was originally standing. The air currents were as sharp as blades, scattering the grass and leaves, and gaps of various sizes immediately appeared in the grass. Scarlet's reaction was not slow either. She dodged the translucent air like a beautiful leopard and closed in on him. The Saint Hydra's second round of attack could come at any time. Just as the two were about to leave the dangerous place, they heard an angry roar. "Did I allow you to leave?" Among the three of them, Veronica took the brunt of the attack. Hundreds of air currents formed a terrifying white whirlwind in the air. Under normal circumstances, even an elemental awakened would not be able to survive. But what surprised Brando and Scarlet was that not only was Veronica fine, she even had the strength to hold them back. Brando could not help but look back. At this moment, a sky-blue transparent air shield had appeared around Veronica. The sharp white air currents that hit the shield were immediately deflected to one side. Although the transparent air shield flickered, it did not look like it would break anytime soon. Veronica held her sword in one hand and stood still in the middle of the storm of attacks. Her eyes were about to spit fire. Brendel swallowed his saliva, knowing that he had truly angered her this time. Facing an enraged war goddess of the Empire was not his hobby. As soon as he saw Veronica's sword move, he immediately jumped into the side of the valley. A ray of white light shot out from Veronica's sword. It formed a white sword light that was dozens of meters wide. The sword light flew over Brando and Scarlet's head and hit the stream not far away. With a loud bang, the sword light evaporated the water from the riverbed. The stream was cut off for a moment, and it took a while for the water to flow again. The Supreme Sword Saint's full power was truly terrifying. Brendel's scalp went numb as he looked at the broken stream. He looked back and saw Veronica's second sword in her hand. He immediately knew that something was wrong. He quickly turned around and grabbed Scarlet's hand. "Scarlet, get ready." Scarlet was stunned, but Brando had already activated his charge. Veronica's second sword was just a hair's breadth away from Brando. As he turned into a continuous black line and disappeared into the forest, the sword light hit a row of trees with a loud bang. At that moment, it was as if a gust of wind had swept through the forest. Dozens of huge trees that would require 10 people to wrap their arms around them were chopped in half and sent flying far away before they crashed to the ground. Veronica could not help but grit her teeth when she saw that her sword had missed its target. She had never lost her composure like this since the Highland War with the Hazel people. However, the fact that the young man was able to see through her moves one after another made her suspicious. She even began to suspect that the young man had some sort of relationship with her. Her swordsmanship, Sky Wall, was a secret swordsmanship of the Presco family that was never passed down to outsiders. It was also a superb swordsmanship that was rarely seen in the Kurlutz Empire that used the wind element as its foundation. However, the sword barrier, backflow required the wielder to remain motionless. Before the aftershock of the Saint Hydra's attack arrived, Veronica could only watch as Brando escaped. She looked up, wanting to see how long the giant beast would continue its attack. Although the sword barrier, backflow was known to be invincible, it was still an exaggeration. If the Saint Hydra had gone all out, the goddess of war would not have dared to be so careless. However, when she looked up, she was a little surprised. Veronica saw that the seventh head of the Saint Hydra had completely disintegrated into countless air arrows. The white air currents scattered in the air and then converged in her direction. For a moment, it looked like a white chrysanthemum blooming in the night sky. It was also a deadly flower. Veronica frowned slightly. She activated her wind element, and the green light around her thickened by another layer. No matter how many air arrows hit the air shield, it was not affected at all. But she was curious why the Saint Hydra would scatter its attacks. Was it just to ensure that it would hit its target? But that was not normal. The Saint Hydra should be a high-grade monster with intelligence. The battle-hardened goddess of war immediately became alert. She then noticed that the air arrows did not disappear after piercing into the forest. Instead, they gathered together. Mist? Veronica's sharp eyebrows twitched as she saw that the fog had reformed into white nights. She had never seen those tall knights in any literature before, and the armor formed by the fog was not the standard of any country in the world of Vaunt. They were not elves, humans, dwarves, or even undead. What is this? Veronica noticed that the Saint Hydra's new attack was not the air arrows, but the strange knights that had reformed in the forest. She dispelled her barrier and looked at the new enemies with caution. On the other side, Brando dragged Scarlet with him and stopped a few hundred meters away in an instant. There were too many obstacles in the forest. He was afraid that Veronica or the Saint Hydra would catch up to them. He did not dare to delay and rushed towards the entrance of the valley with Scarlet in tow. Brando knew that with the goddess of war behind him, there was no way he could return to the White Rock. He could only continue forward. Fortunately, the frost wave had passed and surviving in the dark forest was not a problem for him. But Amandina will be very worried. He thought to himself, but he couldn't care less about that at this moment. Just as Brando thought about it, Orthless suddenly warned him, "Be careful." He raised his head, and suddenly a spear pierced through the fog in front of him. Because the entire process was silent, he almost collided with it head-on. He quickly retreated and bumped into Scarlet, who was behind him. Both of them groaned in pain, but Brando did not have time to feel the warmth of her body. He retreated and pushed Scarlet to the side, allowing the spear to graze his chest. Then he saw the enemy clearly. A knight riding a gigantic four-legged dragon slowly walked out of the mist. This first impression was a little wrong because it was more accurate to say that it was a tall and muscular knight that came out of the mist. Or is that thing made of mist? It retracted its spear and looked at Brando with a blurry face. Brando looked at it and felt goosebumps all over his body. There's more than one Saint Hydra in the mist. There are more monsters. That was the first thought that came to his mind. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, the knight raised his spear and stabbed again. His attack was fast and ruthless, and the mist spear was very special. When he attacked, there was almost no air flow. Brando was not used to this, but he noticed that the enemy was not very strong. It was only at the level of a gold-ranked knight, and its biggest weakness was its lack of agility. To prove this point, Brando decisively used a common trick in the game to lure the enemy to attack. The knight fell for it and Brando grabbed the spear. But he grabbed nothing but air. It's an incorporeal creature. Brando was shocked, but his right hand did not slow down. Haurangaya pierced through the enemy. Haurangaya was a magic sword that was at the same level as Haurangaya. It did not care if the enemy was an incorporeal creature. The magic on the sword pierced the enemy's heart. The knight raised its head and howled in pain, then turned back into mist and dissipated into the forest. System, you have defeated the demon Misty Nightmare, part of it. You have received 1510 EXP. Then green words appeared in his vision. Brando was slightly surprised. He gritted his teeth. The monster gave 1510 EXP, which was close to the Lord tier Black Wolf. But it was just a normal monster. It was not an elite, nor was it a Lord tier monster. Furthermore, the notification said that the Misty Nightmare, part of it, was repelled, not killed. It was a bit like fighting zombies. If not killed with spells or weapons with purifying properties, the Misty Nightmare would only be temporarily immobilized. At this time Orthless said, "Boy, there's a familiar scent on this thing." "A familiar scent?" "I'll give you a hint. It's the Saint Hydra." "Wait." Bran seemed to have realized something. "Lady Orthless, are you saying that this thing is formed by the Saint Hydra?" "That's fast." "No wonder it's a Misty Nightmare, part of it, and it has the ability to regenerate." Brando could not help but take a deep breath. If what Orthless said was true, then this thing was definitely not the Saint Hydra. Or rather, the Saint Hydra was just an image of the Misty Nightmare. If that was the case, then it should be some kind of monster that lived in the fog. Misty Nightmare, he seemed to have heard of this name on the forums. But this monster seemed to be ridiculously strong. At this time, Scarlet nudged his hand and motioned for him to look at the ground not far away. Brando was startled. He looked in that direction and saw that there were many figures in the fog where the Misty Knight disappeared. He could vaguely see that they were human. Again, Brando subconsciously raised Haurangaya in his hand. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 423. The forest was already shrouded in fog, and the sky was nowhere to be seen. The Lernea Hydra's silhouette had long been hidden behind the fog, and no one knew if it was still standing in the valley. Brando suspected that at least part of it had vaporized, or else the forest would not be so shrouded in fog. The figures behind the fog quickly approached, and Brando was slightly startled. They were not vaporized knights but real humans. The knights wore golden red cloaks with fire crows embroidered on their chests. The cleric in the middle wore a golden red silk robe with a triangular bishop's crown on his head. The word flame was embroidered on his shoulder straps in a fiery red cruse font. Only a cleric of the Holy Cathedral of Fire could wear such luxurious clothing. Brando recognized him from the shriveled old face. It was Amon, the high-ranking cleric of Ankh. He frowned. This guy is not easy to deal with, but on the surface he appeared humble. Brando sheathed his sword and placed his hand on his chest. He bowed slightly. Cleric. But in his heart he thought, that bastard. Why did the Holy Cathedral send such a notorious bastard? Aren't they afraid of offending the Druids? Amon looked at the young man who appeared out of nowhere and was satisfied. His attitude was 1,000 times better than the mercenaries he met before. A noble is a noble. He looked at Brando and thought, at least he's educated and reasonable. But he seems to be from Erewhon? Amon did not know that the players in the game had a way of dealing with high-ranking NPCs like him. Brando's reaction was basically second nature to him. Even Scarlet gave her lord a strange look, wondering if he was a little too unruly. Amon and the others came out of the forest to check if there were any knights like before. There were no knights around, only trainee knights. This made Amon very cautious. The knight Raymond had died in the battle with the Lernea Hydra, and everyone was shocked. Since the November War, the Holy Cathedral had not had a high-ranking knight return to the sacred flame for many years. But Amon felt the object on his chest and thought that the knight Raymond's sacrifice was not in vain. He sighed softly. The cleric looked up with a kind expression. Young man, you're not bad. Where are you from? Where is this place? How far are we from the Pass of Wolves? Amon asked 3 questions in one breath. Even though he tried his best to control, Brando could tell that he was nervous. What is a high-ranking cleric nervous about? Brando was a little puzzled. Is it just because of the monster? But the people of the Holy Cathedral would not be so afraid just because of the death of 100 or so people. They were all fanatics. Amon was not a good person, but at most he had a flaw in his personality. Anyone who could become a high-ranking cleric was a person with a strong will. He lowered his head and did not think too much about it to avoid arousing the other party's suspicions. I am Baron Ferber. Esteemed priestess, I'm afraid that you have never heard of Trentheim, a remote and desolate place, so my name is not worth mentioning. On the other hand, esteemed priestess, I don't know where this place is, but we are not far from Wolf's Pass. Brando said a lot of nice words to get rid of this guy. He was worried that Veronica would catch up with them at any time, and the people of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would definitely not stand on his side. But Brando did not dare to show his eagerness. It was a small matter if he aroused suspicion, but it would be fun if he was labeled as disrespectful to the Holy Cathedral. Don't be fooled by this guy's amiable face. Brendel knew what kind of person he was. Amon nodded. They were not far from the Pass of Wolves. This news lifted his spirits and the fatigue on his wrinkled face disappeared. But he felt that it would be too unreasonable to leave just like that. Although the Holy Cathedral was high and mighty, it was not good to give people the impression that they were arrogant and domineering. So the cleric stopped and said to Brando, Mr. Baron, we are in a hurry to leave this area. Would you like to come with us? Brando sneered. The Holy Cathedral had always been a lone wolf, and this guy had invited him with a face full of rejection. Fortunately, he did not mind. He shook his head and said, You should know that I'm also here for the Lionheart sword. Even if I'm not destined to have it, I don't want to have any regrets. So I have to continue. Amon nodded. He resisted the urge to use his skinny fingers to check if the thing was still in place. He could not wait for Brando to reject him. But when Brando mentioned the Lionheart sword, he raised his head and looked at Brando curiously. If that's the case, then we won't hinder you. Mr. Baron, you have an extraordinary upbringing. When we return to the Holy Cathedral, I will write a letter to His Majesty to express my gratitude. Amon promised with an amiable face. For a moment, it seemed that his originally gloomy mood had been reversed. Brando smiled slightly and did not comment. He seemed to be full of the elegance of a noble. But in his heart, he was cursing Brendel for saying so many high-sounding words. Get out of here. Are you still the arrogant and greedy Amon? Please don't destroy the original setting. Also, my time is limited. Can't you make it short? Brando scolded Amon for a long time. Finally, he was ready to leave. Unfortunately, things did not go as he wished. Just as the priest of Ankh was about to leave, a person suddenly appeared from the bushes behind him. It was none other than Veronica. When the goddess of war from Cruz saw Brando, she did not say a word and directly slashed her sword at him. The sword brought along a slanted ray of light. Brando hurriedly dodged, and with a whoosh, the sword aura split a black pine tree behind him into 2 halves. The tree fell back with a cracking sound. Her slash. Amon and the Holy Cathedral Knight who were about to leave were stunned. The priest raised his eyebrows and was about to fly into a rage. But when he saw who the woman in front of him was, he suddenly shuddered and swallowed his words. Although his status was high, he was still inferior to the 4 commanders of crews. In terms of reputation they were about the same, but everyone knew that the real power of nobles was to have soldiers under their command. Not to mention that Veronica was the Azure Sword Saint and the leader of the Firmament Army. She was also from one of the 12 oldest families in Kurlutz. In terms of strength, Amon was no match for her. Perhaps some of the priests in the wealthiest areas could be on par with this woman, but Amon was not one of them. But since he was sure that the woman in front of him was not to be trifled with, he immediately turned around and looked at Brando coldly. The meaning in his dull grayish-brown eyes was obvious. What was going on? Brando could almost read the question from his eyes. He really changed his attitude faster than flipping a book. After the slash, Veronica appeared beside Brando without a word and reached out to grab Brando's shoulder. Brando hurriedly stepped back and blocked in front of Scarlet, afraid that the woman would use the same trick again. But this time, Veronica was charging straight at him. After her first attack missed, she immediately pressed down on him again. Brando could not dodge and could only block with Haurangaya. A row of rock spikes stood up and blocked Veronica. But Veronica was already furious. She directly punched a hole in the rock spikes and reached out to grab Brando's shoulder. Priest Amon could not help but raise his eyebrows slightly when he saw the two fighting, especially when Brando's Haurangaya made his eyes move. Brando knew that his strength was far inferior to the crew's goddess of war. At this moment he no longer cared about his image and fell back and rolled to the side. The bumpy ground of the forest hurt his back, but he could only endure. He rolled back and immediately shouted, "Scarlet." Scarlet understood and immediately got up and fled to the side. Brando's charge cooldown was almost finished. He threw a card of fate on the ground. Of course no one could see it. They only saw a flaming red magic circle suddenly appear on the ground, and then a huge fire djinn rushed out from it and pounced on Veronica. This sudden attack surprised Veronica. She instinctively wanted to withdraw and retreat, but she felt that the fire djinn was only a silver tear. She thought that Brando was trying to stall for time. After a little hesitation, she rushed straight at the fire djinn. She turned the azure firmament in her hand and wanted to give the fire djinn a fatal blow. She did not think that this was exactly what Brando wanted. Brando retreated and snapped his fingers at the fire djinn. Explode! A ray of golden light burst out from the fire djinn's body. The majestic power contained in it made Veronica, who bore the brunt of it, pale. This was the terrifying power of a silver-tier elemental creature releasing all of its magic and fire elements in an instant. The attack almost crossed the threshold of elemental power. Then there was a loud bang and the white light penetrated into everyone's eyes. Everyone could not help but close their eyes. Only Brando, who was already prepared, took this opportunity and frantically retreated in the direction of the forest in his memory. But at this time he heard the familiar voice of Priest Amon, "Wall of Holy Words." Brando immediately felt that there was an inexplicable power behind him. He did not need to look back to know what it was. This translucent wall of light was one of the few field control spells of the priest. Brando immediately stopped. The length of the wall of light created by the priest's holy words was more than 100 meters, but the height was less than 10 meters. He lifted his sword up, and a rock spike suddenly rose from the ground. Brando intended to use this rock spike to cross the wall of light. But the next moment, the sound of air breaking came from afar. A white sword aura swept through the center of the rock spike that had just grown out like lightning. With a crack, the rock spike suddenly broke from the middle. Brando's plan naturally failed. He turned around and found that Veronica had recovered from the previous explosion. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 424. At this moment, Veronica was no longer as calm and composed as before. The initial explosion had damaged her uniform, and even her beautiful sky blue hair had been scorched in several places. The blue shield around her was not enough to protect her. The crew's goddess of war stared coldly at Brando. The importance of hair to a woman was self-evident. At this moment, Veronica was in the mood to kill Brando. She withdrew her sword, and the air around her disappeared. At the same time she turned her sword, and with 3 fingers on her left hand on her right hand, she gritted her teeth and stabbed towards Brando. A blue light swept towards Brando with the tip of the sword as the center. Brando reacted at the last moment. He tilted his head to the side and the sword swept past his cheek. The young lord felt a cold pain on his cheek. He did not need to think to know that the sword had hurt his cheek. "You're that noble Erewhon. I remember now." Amon interrupted. He raised his finger and pointed at Brando. His finger pointed at a cross-shaped circle of light. "I heard that you have the Heaven's Armament?" Brendel was taken aback, but he did not dare to act rashly because of Amon's holy strike. He glared hatefully at Veronica. This woman actually dared to expose this matter out of my expectations. She's completely different from the goddess of war in history. Could it be that I've guessed wrongly? "I didn't say it," Veronica replied coldly. She raised her eyebrows and remembered Vahina and the others sneaking around. Then she understood. Veronica replied expressionlessly, "But you can also look for me. I'll accompany you anytime." "My two lords, you're bullying the young. How can you say such a thing?" Brando wiped the blood off his face and sneered. Although he said so verbally, he had already tensed up and was ready to fight back. Veronica would definitely not let him go today, and Amon would not let him go easily either. In that case he could only give it his all. Brando sneered, revealing his white teeth. He stared at Amon with a gaze as cold as a wolf's. He was never a person who would put his fate in the hands of others and compromise with anyone. There is no difference when it comes to heretics. Anyone who can still move with their eyes will be killed. Amon turned a deaf ear to Brando's words. His eyes fell on the sword in Brando's hand, thinking that it must be the Haurangaya that the nobles and crews had been talking about. The Haurangaya was not only famous in the mountains of Toquinen. If Amon could get his hands on it, his status in the holy sanctum would be elevated. As for whether Brando was a member of the Templar or not, it didn't matter to him. As soon as he finished speaking, the holy strike on his finger shone brightly. The golden circle of light in the shape of a cross expanded in an instant, and a light bullet shot out from it towards Brando. However, a green light flashed from the side as Veronica used her sword as a whip and lashed out at the ball of light, sending it flying into the forest in the distance. With a loud bang, a bright spot of light exploded in the misty valley. Veronica turned around and said coldly, "If you want to kill him, you'll have to ask for my permission, Lord Amon." "Lord Veronica?" Amon was slightly startled. The high priest was smart enough to understand immediately. "I understand. Lord Veronica, you want him alive." Veronica did not say anything and Brando secretly retreated. Both Amon and Veronica had the power of elemental activation. It was unrealistic for him to fight both of them alone. He could not wait for the two of them to fight because of the conflict, but that was obviously impossible. Amon was obviously trying to please Veronica. He lowered his head and silently counted the cooldown of charge in his heart. 20-19-18, a cold wind blew through the canopy in the valley, and the forest rustled, but the fog that shrouded the surroundings did not move. "Well, Lord Veronica," Amon said at this time. "In short, if you want to force a heretic to submit, it's best to capture him first. But compared to that, it's easier to start with his companions." With that, the high priest turned his head to the side of the forest. Brando saw Amon looking in that direction and his face suddenly changed. Scarlet had just escaped from there. Amon's intention was self-evident. Veronica made a soft sound, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. "You're courting death." Brando could no longer hold back and dragged Haurangaya straight towards Amon. But at this time, Amon turned his head and smiled slyly at him. The meaning on his face was obvious. He was waiting for this attack. A white halo appeared on the high priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The halo flashed from head to toe, and the high priest disappeared into thin air. The next moment he appeared behind Brando and at the same time, a red light shot out from his hand. This was not the high priest's spell. Brando was really stunned this time, but his 100 years of experience as a warrior came into play at this moment. He almost instinctively ducked his head to avoid Amon's attack. The red light flew past Brando's hair and landed in the bushes. The red light flashed and a flame immediately jumped out of the bushes. Brando took advantage of the momentum to roll forward. He was surprised that the high priest usually did not know any spells other than holy spells, but the move just now was obviously not any holy spell that Brando was familiar with. It was more like an elemental spell, but Amon's elemental spell was Iron Wall. He knew this very well. Brando pounced forward, and the high priest also pointed forward with a sneer. "Holy word, bind." Brando's heart went cold when he heard this incantation. He could not dodge in his current state, and as a lower gold, it was difficult for him to resist an elemental spell. The only thing he could do now was to pray to Martha and hope that she had not completely forgotten about him. However, Ever since he entered the loop of trade winds, he had provoked one powerful enemy after another. It did not seem like Martha was protecting him. But at the mention of protection, Brando suddenly had an idea. The golden light in Amon's hand pierced forward. It was originally aimed at the fallen Brando, but in the next moment, a door of light suddenly opened between the young lord and Amon. A majestic white deer strode out, and the high priest's spell hit the white deer's chest. Logically speaking, the white deer did not have a physical body, and physical attacks would have gone through it. Unfortunately, Amon had not only cast a spell, but also a holy spell. The white deer statue happened to be a holy item of the holy attribute, and the summoned white deer was no exception. The holy word, bind, immediately dissipated when it hit the white deer. It did not even have the most basic binding effect. Holy white deer. Amon never dreamed that Brando would play this trick on him. But when he was stunned, misfortune immediately fell upon him. At that moment, a sudden gust of wind blew through the forest. The sudden gust of wind made the three of them subconsciously turn their heads back. "My lord, be careful," Scarlet shouted anxiously from the forest. The red-haired girl had been hiding far away from the battlefield so that she could meet up with Brando after he escaped. But she did not expect that Brando would be left behind. She wanted to go back to help, but she was worried that she would be a burden to Brando. But at that moment, she, who was the furthest away, was the first to see the situation on the battlefield. She saw a huge white head suddenly appear above the vast fog. It was one of the heads of the Saint Hydra. She was the second to notice the changes in the surroundings. She was guarding Brando's escape route and was about to make a move, but a sudden warning in her heart saved her life. She subconsciously withdrew her sword, and with a swing of the azure firmament, dozens of green air currents immediately formed a barrier around her. Her action saved her life because the Saint Hydra had already raised its head high and was about to bite down. One of the fangs made of fog crashed into the barrier around her and shattered. The other fangs almost grazed Brando's nose as he fell to the ground. Although the young lord was unharmed, he was still scared out of his wits. Among the three, Amon was the most unlucky. One of the fangs bit into his back and hit his robe. If not for the last layer of protection provided by his robe, Amon would have met the Flame King Gretel immediately. But even so, it was still not easy for him. He was sent flying far away, and his whole body rolled a few times in the air before falling heavily to the ground. When he landed, a gray gem fell out of his collar and rolled a few times before landing in the bushes nearby. Only Brando and Veronica, who were the closest to him, saw this scene. Even Amon, who was in a daze from the fall, did not notice it, let alone the knights of the Holy Cathedral who were further away. "Little guy," Orthless suddenly called out, "that gem looks familiar." Brando had just recovered from the shock, but when he heard this, his heart skipped a beat. As a heroic spirit from the War of the Holy Saints, Orthless's knowledge was self-evident. If she only had a vague impression of something, then it was obvious which era it came from. Where did Amon get this thing from? But he did not have time to be surprised. The Saint Hydra had already begun its attack on them. When the behemoth's attack failed, 3 more heads immediately appeared above the fog. 6 pairs of crimson eyes immediately locked onto everyone present. Then they let out an earth-shattering roar and began to attack the tiny ants in the forest. But when the 3 heads attacked, Brando was pleasantly surprised to find that they were all targeting Amon and Veronica. Not a single attack was directed at him. He carefully laid on the ground, not daring to even breathe too loudly. Although the Misty Nightmare was not a real divine beast, its strength was not to be underestimated. When the Saint Hydra attacked, Amon and Veronica immediately fell into a bitter struggle. Even the reserve knight of the Holy Cathedral who wanted to save their priestesses lost 2 in the blink of an eye. Brando did not know why this happened, but how could he let go of such a good opportunity? He immediately rolled a few steps away from the bush and got up to escape the battlefield. "Stop right there." Although Veronica was resisting the attacks of the Saint Hydra, her attention was focused on Brando. When she saw that Brando was about to escape, she was furious. The female sword saint swung her sword forward, and a beam of light shot towards Brando. Unfortunately, she knew that her attack would not hit the young man. She could only watch as Brando ran further and further away. She wanted to give chase, but just as she raised her foot, the 2 Saint Hydra heads blocked her path. "Bastard!" Veronica gritted her teeth and cursed for the first time. Author's note, it's basically sorted out. Sigh, it's so painful. But at least it won't be broken anymore. Sigh, I've kept everyone waiting. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 425. Priest Amon, stop him. Veronica shouted to Amon as she saw Brando running further and further away. She knew that she could not stop Brando, so she could only shout at him. But at the same time, she frowned as she sensed the Hydra Saint coming at her from the side. She quickly turned around and swung her sword at the two heads in front of her. Cyan firmament struck the center of the nose of the first head of the Hydra Saint, but the white mist only sank back for a moment before returning to its original state. The resulting thrust pushed the Kurlutzian goddess of war back nearly 10 meters. As Veronica retreated, the second head swooped down on her. She snorted and rolled to the side to avoid the attack. The white mist rolled across the forest floor, knocking the surrounding black pines to the side. It was as if a gust of wind had passed through, blowing the Sword Saint's azure hair and blocking her vision. She turned her head to the side and saw the trainee knight of the Holy Cathedral blocking the other two heads at the cost of their lives. They formed two rows in front of Amon to buy time for the priest to cast his spell. Amon hesitated as he got up. He did not know whether to stop Brando or deal with the Hydra Saint. He only had one chance. If he chose to deal with Brando, none of his knight would survive. But in the end, his greed for Haoran Gaia overcame his rationality. Amon raised his right hand and drew the emblem of the Holy Cathedral of Fire with the agate ring on his index finger. In the name of fire you may run, but in the end you will not be able to escape. He pointed at Brando. Flame's prayer, come back. Brando, who was running away, almost fainted when he heard the incantation. The Flame's prayer was a part of the greater holy words, and it was being used by the priest from Ankh to deal with a small fry like him. It was common knowledge that in Wond, there were only two professions that could cast holy word spells above the seventh circle: witches and priests. As for the witches' curses and the priests' prophecies, they were all known as the words of the gods. They were definitely the greatest weapons among the many spells. This was especially true for pure warriors with low will. Although Brando had the level of an elementalist, it was too low for him. He only felt that Amon's incantation had just stopped, and in a flash, he appeared in front of him in a circle of fire. To hell with it. Brando cursed inwardly. He immediately turned around and faced Amon, who was sneering at him. He was practically grinding his teeth as he said, "It seems that Lord Heavenly Priest wants to keep me here." "Of course," Amon replied. "I hope you won't regret it." Brendel did not waste any more time and turned his sword around. He held Haoran Gaia with both hands and thrust it towards Amon. Arrogant and crazy. Amon's face turned cold. Most people would be a little hesitant and afraid when going against the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but Brando's decisiveness made him feel that his authority was being challenged. The priest raised his left hand coldly. Solid wall. A golden hexagonal shield of light opened up with his palm as the center, causing Brando's sword to draw a long line of sparks. Brando knew that this wasn't a spell but Amon's elemental power. Amon's spell was ready at this time. A fiery red light shrouded the priest's robe. Amon was using a holy spell to buff himself. "I advise you to surrender without putting up a fight." Amon dispersed the hexagonal shield of light in front of him with one hand, and at the same time raised his other hand to grab Brando's Haoran Gaia. He held the blade between his thumb and index finger, and when his skin touched the sharp surface of the metal, there was an ear-piercing sound similar to metal clashing. Holy spell, Iron Fist, holy power. The priest used a holy spell to buff himself, and after the buff, his close combat ability was no less than a fully armed warrior. Although Amon had only used 2 holy spells, Brando could feel that his strength was no less than his own when he wasn't using his full strength. Amon grabbed Brando's sword and laughed in a low voice. "Although the Baron is a heretic, the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the Holy Cathedral of Fire are not at war yet. According to the rules between nobles, my lord should believe that the Holy Cathedral of Fire will not harm a noble so easily. The Baron can still pay the ransom for himself." The priest of Ankh took the time to check if his knight could still hold up against the Hydra, and at the same time he gave Brando his conditions. Why does this guy's laughter sound so familiar? The thought flashed through Brando's mind, but it only lasted for a moment. The fact that they were still in the middle of a battle made Brando grit his teeth and tried to pull his sword back. Amon's grip on Haoran Gaia made him feel that he would not be able to pull his sword back unless he exerted all his strength. After confirming this, Brando sighed and sneered, "Oh? In that case, in your opinion, what should I pay in order to redeem my life?" "Haoran Gaia, lead the way for Commander Veronica, is that okay?" In Amon's opinion, killing Brando was the safest option, but since Veronica did not agree, he could only settle for the next best thing. But it was basically impossible for Brando to hand over Haurangaya, let alone lead the way for Veronica. He looked at the somewhat astute eyes of the heavenly priest and secretly took a deep breath. Mon. One of the few regional priests in the Holy Cathedral. Although his position was not the highest in Brando's mind, he was definitely one of the most difficult to deal with. Amon's elemental element was solid wall, which belonged to the lowest level of micro-elemental elements. But in the Amber Sword, it was not the level of elemental elements that determined everything. Mixed elemental elements were chaotic and weak, and existential power was absolutely invincible. High-level elemental elements represented more possibilities, and low-level elemental elements could also exert great power if used appropriately. Amon was an example. Relying on the solid wall elemental element as a backup, he made up for the priest's weakness of needing time to buff himself in a one-on-one battle. When a priest was in his full state, even a wizard would not dare to face him head-on, let alone a warrior. In Vaunt, a priestess who was in her peak state was known as a god. In Brendel's impression, only a berserker and a berserker's berserkers or some special advanced classes could fight against a priestess in her peak state. Not to mention that Amon was a few levels higher than him, and this guy probably only needed about one-third of his buff to beat him up. This absolute difference in power made Brando silent for a moment until Amon spoke again. "Are you trying to buy time, Baron?" Amon chuckled. "Maybe you are a little fearless and Lady Veronica won't kill you, but that doesn't mean that others will be treated the same." Brando was startled. "Your loyal subordinate is hiding not far from here, but it seems that the beautiful lady is more likely to be Mr. Baron's companion. I'm sure Mr. Baron wouldn't want to see anything happen to his companion, right?" Amon glanced at the forest. Amon did not know that his words had ignited Brando's anger in an instant. If there was a bottom line in Brando's heart, it would be everyone related to him. Perhaps it was because he came from the heavy past where he witnessed the death of the Valkyrie and the Regent Princess. He had seen too many stories of loss and sorrow. Brando knew that if he wanted to break free from this heavy chain, he had to shatter this history and change it with the power he had in his hands. Therefore he would not allow anyone to threaten him with such means. He made up his mind in an instant. Brando shook his sword-wielding arms, and with a burst of power, he pulled Haurangaya's blade back from Amon's hand. Amon could not help but be startled and took a step back subconsciously. But as soon as he took a step back, Brando immediately closed in on him. In Amon's view, Brando's move was to prevent him from using this solid wall element again. But at this moment the priest from Ink was a little surprised. At such a close distance he could not use the solid wall element, but Brando could not dodge his attack either. Don't forget that the priest did not only have buff spells. "You only care about the head but not the tail," Amon sneered and stretched out his 5 fingers. A cross-shaped halo appeared on each of his 5 fingers. "Holy strike!" he shouted in a low voice, and 5 light bullets were shot out instantly. Amon did not use his full strength. He knew very well that with the opponent's strength, such a simple attack would not be able to hurt him, so he was ready for the second attack. In his view, Brando had to dodge, and the only way to avoid the 5 holy strike was to dodge to the side. But after the first attack, Amon raised his hand again, and a holy word, bind, was already waiting on Brando's planned route. However, what happened next almost made the high priest drop the spell in his hand in a daze, causing the spell to backfire on him. Because he did not see Brando coming. He saw Brando rushing straight at the 5 holy strike he threw out. Although the 5 holy strike were not at full strength, if all of them hit a person with only the strength of the golden domain, it would still be fatal. Is this guy crazy? Although the young man was covered in blood, he was still moving forward. How is this possible? Amon could not react for a moment. He only knew that Veronica would be severely injured if she took the full brunt of his holy strike. But this guy seemed to be fine. A berserker? But Brando's calm and sober eyes told him otherwise. In that moment of hesitation, Brando had already closed in on him. Amon believed that if the young man attacked with a sword, his robe with defensive spells would help him. The robe of a priest was passed down from generation to generation, and its defensive power was astonishing. He had even used it to block the attack of the Hydra, so it should be able to block this young man's attack. But what Amon did not expect was for Brando to hug him. "Bastard, let go of me." Amon didn't expect a gold-ranked swordsman to hug him like a gangster in a fight. But he soon realized that it was an effective method. After his hands and feet were bound, he realized that he couldn't cast any spells. As a respected priest, this was the first time Amon had encountered such a situation. He panicked and could only feel Brando pushing him in a certain direction. Brando, on the other hand, was familiar with the situation. Players were always unscrupulous in a fight, and he knew all too well how to restrain a wizard or a priest. Although this method was not completely effective, he believed that Amon would not be able to react in time. As long as he had a few seconds, it would be enough. Brando's gamble paid off. Amon could not think of a way to deal with such a ridiculous tactic. While he was panicking, he suddenly heard Veronica's warning, "Careful." Amon turned around subconsciously. His face paled when he saw that his knights couldn't hold on any longer. The huge head of the mist-formed Hydra Saint was smashing through a few of them and heading towards them. "Is this kid trying to drag me down with him?" Amon's expression changed drastically as he guessed Brando's real intention. P.S. Today's chapter is here. In addition, there were 2 chapters with 163 scenes, and 1 chapter was actually 164 scenes. As for the title and whatnot, you just had to figure it out yourself. Some of my classmates are asking me when I'll be back with 2 chapters, so I'll be doing one for a few days to ease the tension. I'll be back soon. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 426. Amon's eyes reflected the head of the Hydra Saint that was growing bigger and bigger. He saw the monster opening its mouth, and he could see the sharp teeth in its bloody mouth. It was getting closer and closer. He couldn't help but stare with wide eyes and shout, "Let go of me. Are you crazy? TSK. Even a high priest of the Holy Cathedral is afraid of madness?" Brendel wrapped his arms around Amon's waist and carried him forward, revealing his pearly white teeth as he laughed coldly. "Brando." Veronica turned around and saw the young man named Erwin charging towards the Tyrannosaurus with Amon in his arms. "Let go of him. What are you doing?" She could not believe that Brando would dare to kill Amon. Although she did not think highly of Amon, she was a witness to the death of a high priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Things were getting complicated. And, "Let go. Young man, you'll die too." Amon had never been so afraid since he became a high priest. He felt as if his blood had frozen, and his words were incoherent. "I won't die." He raised his head and looked into Amon's eyes with a faint smile. Amon was stunned by Brando's stare, and screamed like a pig being slaughtered. "How dare you kill a high priest of the Holy Cathedral?" Brando pursed his lips. The 2 of them crashed into the Tyrannosaurus' mouth, and a half-meter-long fang pierced through Amon's back. With Brando and the Tyrannosaurus' combined strength, Amon's robe could not save his life. Amon spat out a mouthful of blood, and the intense pain made him cough violently. But Brando did not have it easy either. The other fang that pierced through Amon's body had also pierced through his chest. Brando only managed to slightly deflect it from his heart and pierced through his lung. Brando immediately spat out a mouthful of blood. The green light on his retina immediately turned red, a warning that his life was in danger. This was the first time he had encountered such a situation since he was resurrected in Brando's body. It was not just excessive blood loss but severe internal injuries. His heart and lungs were failing. This was bad. "My lord." Brando heard a scream from the forest. It was Scarlet's voice. But he just shook his head, and his consciousness became clear again after a brief moment of blur. His retina began to show a pale gray scene. This meant that his indomitable will had begun to take over his body, and he only had a few minutes left. But this time he seemed to have suffered too much damage. His indomitable will, which had always been successful, was barely working this time. His body was showing signs of exhaustion. But this was not the case when the indomitable will was in effect. All these thoughts flowed through Brando's mind like a quiet stream. In fact, he had already woken up when he shook his head. At this moment, the Tyrannosaurus closed its jaws and was about to bite him. Brando knew the consequences of being bitten, but he still wanted to live. He loosened his grip on Amon's back. The cleric's body tilted as if he had stopped breathing. Brando took the opportunity to pull out Haurangaya and thrust it upwards. Haurangaya went straight into the Tyrannosaurus's soft mouth. The massive creature raised its head in pain and let out a roar that shook the valley. Brando took the opportunity to pull out Haurangaya and aimed at the creature's throat with the Ring of the Wind Empress with his right hand. The air gathered in an instant and pushed into the Tyrannosaurus's throat. The mist scattered like a flower of blood, and the huge recoil threw Brando away in an instant. Brando was thrown high into the air by the tremendous force and fell into the forest like a cannonball. He felt that he had broken at least a few tree trunks and landed heavily on a shrub. If it were not for his muscles and organs that were nearly 100 times tougher than a normal person's, this would have been a fatal blow that would have taken his life. But Brando only felt dizzy after the violent impact. He tried to get up, but the pain soon overwhelmed him and he fell to the ground again. Brando took a deep breath and the pain in his lungs made him cough violently. When he looked up, he saw that Amon was dead, and Veronica was still being held back by the Tyrannosaurus. The knight trainee of the Holy Cathedral was even more unreliable. In other words, there were no more obstacles in front of him. Brando endured the pain and tried to get up. He wanted to escape into the forest while unyielding will was still in effect. But at that moment he felt a soft hand on his shoulder. He then saw Scarlet's face. "My lord." Brando heard the red-haired girl with a long ponytail shouting. Her voice was filled with anxiety and uneasiness. "I'm not dead yet," Brando replied weakly. "It's almost time." Orthlis's voice sounded. She said in a serious tone, "You're too reckless. Do you know your current situation? It's a miracle that you're still alive." "I'm confident." "Don't you think you're too confident?" Orthlis said in an annoyed tone. Brando could not help but laugh. But his laughter turned into a series of violent coughs. He squinted his eyes and saw the head of the Tyrannosaurus flying in the air. He was afraid that the Tyrannosaurus would find out that he was still alive, so he quickly whispered to Scarlet, "Get me out of here first." Scarlet supported Brando to prevent him from kneeling on the ground. But she quickly turned around and wiped the corner of her eyes. She nodded. The fact that Brando could still talk to her reassured her. Scarlet was strong enough, but when she thought about the possibility of Brando dying in battle, she could not help but feel helpless. In comparison, she would rather die in front of his lordship. At least she would not be sad. Scarlet gritted her teeth and supported Brando. But just as she was about to move forward, Brando suddenly saw something shining in the grass not far away. "That thing." Brando pointed in that direction. Scarlet was startled. She looked in that direction. It was Brando's blood. She saw a gray gemstone lying quietly in the grass. "It's Amon's gemstone." Orthlis's heart skipped a beat. "Yes. You're still paying attention to it at this time? It's the nature of a player to take advantage of opportunities. I can't forget my roots." Brando said weakly, but his voice was fading. "A player?" Orthlis was stunned. "Yes," Brando nodded weakly, "this is my nature. So no matter what, I won't forget my purpose." "My lord," Scarlet shouted, but her voice was already far away. "Pick it up." Brando ordered, "Give it to me." Scarlet was startled, but she gritted her teeth and did as she was told. "I don't know what it is, but since Orthlis recognized it, it must be something extraordinary." Brendel closed his eyes in relief. "I don't know what it is, but since Orthlis recognized it, it must be something extraordinary." He would not let go of such a good opportunity. For a moment, he felt that Scarlet was leading him through the forest. He did not know if the Lernaea Hydra had caught up. He struggled to untie the bottles of number 21 holy water that were tied to his belt. Some of them were not as effective as the number 5 holy water, but at least there was enough of them. Brendel had obtained a lot of them from Baron Grodden's collection. Some of them were defective products that he made with Medea's help, but most of them were distributed. Brando drank 5 bottles in one go, but he only felt slightly better. Number 21 holy water was the final product of the mass-produced holy water. It could even be made by a priestess, but its effect was terrible. It was even said by the players that it could only relieve pain. In fact, it was not much different. After drinking all of the holy water that he and Scarlet brought, he felt that his HP had only recovered to a critical level, but his condition was still a mess. His damaged lungs and wounds that had not fully healed could take his life at any time. He could only rely on his luck. He took a deep breath and said, "Scarlet." "Yes." "Listen carefully." "My lord?" "There should be a supply point south from here." "Supply point?" Brando coughed. He felt that he did not have much time to explain. The notifications in his vision were getting more and more urgent, and he knew that his life was in danger at any time. He took a deep breath and explained, "It's the same as the white stone of holy light. Bring me there." "Aren't we going back to Miss Medea?" "My lord, your injuries?" Scarlet asked with a frown. Brando shook his head, "Don't go back." He knew that if Veronica had not been killed by the Lernaea, she would have chased them all the way here. Even if she died because of him with the misty nightmare in the valley, it would be suicide to run into it. But, no buts. Brando knew that they had no way out. Their only chance of survival was to enter the center of the loop of trade winds. He was the only one who knew how to enter the center of the loop of trade winds. There, he would be able to get rid of all danger. Only by entering the center of the loop of trade winds would he have the chance to see the legendary Valhalla and ignite the fire of civilization in the Black Forest. That was also his first goal when he came to this world. The first step to changing Erwin was to, he closed his eyes, this is an order. At this moment, the duration of Indomitable will reach its end. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 427. While Brando's life was in danger and he was unconscious, the Lernaea Hydra went berserk after being injured. It raised its heads and howled at the sky, before turning to attack the backup knight of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and Veronica. It was as if it wanted to destroy these insignificant creatures that challenged its authority. Thus, the knight of the Holy Cathedral was met with a calamity. They were struggling to hold on, hoping to buy time for the cleric to cast spells to support them. But Amon's death was no doubt a shocking blow that shattered the confidence of the backup knight of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. With the addition of the Lernaea Hydra's other heads, their front line collapsed in an instant. Many knight of the Holy Cathedral of Fire were bitten in half by the giant dragon head that suddenly emerged from the clouds. The battlefield instantly turned into hell as screams of agony filled the forest. Veronica's brows were locked in a tight frown. She used her sword aura to parry the attacks of the Hydra Saint, but she was not worried about her safety or the safety of others. Instead, she was worried about the unbelievable situation. Amon's death. When she first saw Brando's eyes, her heart skipped a beat. But this cruise goddess of war did not expect Brando to do so without hesitation. He killed a cleric of the Holy Cathedral. It was the Holy Cathedral of Fire that had absolute control over Erwin Cruz and the entire Alliance of Fire for thousands of years. Even if the Cruz people controlled the Holy Cathedral Council, they still did not dare to go against this colossus. The authority of the Holy Cathedral of Fire had long been ingrained in the hearts of the people, and everyone respected it. Standing against the Holy Cathedral was standing against the entire Alliance of Fire. Other than the two great wars in the past, no one dared to declare war on the Holy Cathedral. Even Veronica, who was far more powerful than Amon, did not dare to make a move against him. She was the Legion commander of the Empire, but the Empire would not completely break ties with the Holy Cathedral of Fire over a single Legion commander. That bastard! Veronica clenched her teeth. She gripped azure firmament so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She knew very well that she had to bury what she saw today as a secret in her heart forever. She took a deep breath. The Holy Cathedral of Fire had never had a cleric die in an internal conflict. If this news were to spread, it would be a devastating blow to the Holy Cathedral. It could even shake the foundation of its rule. Once the precedent was set, Veronica could imagine how shaky the prestige that the Holy Cathedral of Fire had built up in the past would be, and the monarchy that was unwilling to succumb to divine authority would naturally become restless. Even the majestic and powerful Emperor of Kurlutz must have thought about it. Therefore, everyone who had personally experienced all of this would become the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Even Veronica couldn't help but gasp at the thought of the secret trial of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. She looked back and saw that the red-haired girl with a long ponytail had already left the forest with Brando's body. She naturally thought that Brando had died under that blow. But for some reason, Veronica felt a trace of pity in her heart. The young man's unyielding character made her feel good. The goddess of war of Cruz could not help but think of her own youth. At that time he was also unwilling to submit to this world. It was a pity that he was Erwin's man. But while Veronica was secretly feeling pity, Scarlet had already brought the unconscious Brando out of the forest. After rolling into the tree hole and losing the lightning spear, she was lucky enough to escape the first attack of the Lernaea Hydra. This saved her and Brando's life. The girl followed Brando's instructions and passed through the mouth of the valley to the south, entering the last checkpoint outside of the storm, the ancient isthmus. For the past 2 days, in order to reach the white stone that Brando mentioned as soon as possible, the girl with a ponytail had not closed her eyes even once. But Brando's breath was getting weaker and weaker, which made Scarlet feel hesitant and uneasy. She was afraid that Brando would stop breathing at any moment. Scarlet's heart was still empty. She did not know how to face all of this. Her thoughts were always running wild, and she would occasionally even cry softly. The further south she went, the thinner the forest in front of her. The lush green of the forest ground gradually turned gray and yellow. Although it was difficult to distinguish the colors in this eternal night without the sun, Scarlet could still make a rough guess based on the vegetation, soil, and rock distribution on the ground. The meadow was scattered to the east and west in this direction, like the hair of a bald man. The brown soil below exposed the edges of rocks, and the trees were sparsely distributed in the distant fog. The valley seemed to have become deathly still in this direction. Finally, in the evening, Scarlet was not sure if she had missed out on a night or more in her exhaustion. But she finally found the place that Brendel was talking about. It was an eye-catching huge white rock in the middle of a dark valley. The rock seemed to be shimmering with a layer of light, and the desolate valley was filled with a holy aura. Without any words, Scarlet knew that she had found the right place. The girl almost rolled and crawled over, but when it came to the last moment, the tension, anxiety, and exhaustion finally defeated her. She tripped over a protruding rock and fell to the ground. Brendel, who was behind him, was also thrown far away. She almost gritted her teeth and got up from the ground, ignoring the stabbing pain in her palms and elbows. She hurriedly crawled over to help Brando up. She put her hand on Brando's chest. The young man's wound had festered, but she could not do anything. The girl could only feel that Brando's heart was still beating faintly, but it was so weak that she could barely feel it. Scarlet finally could not help but cry out loud. She was cold and hungry. When she left the forest, she seemed to have hung her backpack on a tree branch. She did not notice it because she was in a hurry to escape. In the end, all the food and emergency supplies were left behind. The red-haired girl cried for a while before she placed Brando in the huge gap under the rock. She did not dare to leave Brando alone, so she could only sit beside Brando and hope that her lord would get better. But the situation did not develop as she had imagined. The next morning, when Scarlet woke up groggily, she found that Brando's body was changing. In short, the young man's magic was draining away from his body. For a powerful person who had entered the Gold Realm, such a sign was almost an omen of death. Although Scarlet did not know this, the loss of magic was definitely not a good thing. She panicked but could not find a way to stop it. But just as she was feeling anxious, an abrupt voice suddenly rang out. It was a woman's voice. Scarlet was startled. She immediately looked out of the white stone. The only person who appeared in this place at this time could only be Veronica. But what surprised her was that she saw a strange woman. Or rather, a creature with the upper body of a woman and the lower body of a plant. Scarlet did not recognize the woman, but she recognized the unconscious girl who was wrapped around one of her tentacles. It was the daughter of Cruz Farina. Scarlet immediately knew that this woman was the murderer of Tia. She wanted to pull out the dagger at her waist, but it was empty. Scarlet then remembered that she had already thrown it away. She clenched her teeth and looked at withering Overlord Endesa with vigilance. She asked, "Who are you?" When she opened her mouth, she found that her voice had become hoarse and her throat was dry to the point of pain. Endesha was also sizing up the red-haired girl. She seemed to be interested and even had a smile on her face. However, this dangerous woman did not even look at Brando. Her gaze was fixed on Scarlet. "Little girl," Endesha spoke with a slightly emotional voice, "I think I know you." "I don't know you." Scarlet felt that she was on the verge of collapsing, but she still protected Brando with one hand and gritted her teeth. No, Endesha narrowed her eyes and shook her head. "What I mean is, there's a scent on your body that I'm very familiar with." Scarlet did not reply. Endesha smiled. "I remember now this scent, it's the blood of gods." Her eyes lit up and she licked her lips. "Should I call you the Oracle of Lightning?" Scarlet's expression changed drastically. Her already pale face turned as white as a sheet of paper. The pain brought to her by the god's blood was as clear as a knife dripping with blood. She could still remember the night she was killed by the tree shepherd and then resurrected. After that, she was haunted by nightmares every day. She struggled on the brink of collapse every moment. If not for Endesha, she would have already become a mindless monster. Just like the Oracle of Earth she met before. She could not help but stare at Endesha. She knew that this woman was in cahoots with the Oracle of Earth. Tree herders. Sir. Scarlet almost choked, but she still managed to ask. "Hey, you actually recognize us?" "But it's not strange," Endesha replied. "Since you have the blood of gods in your body, you are naturally one of us." She tilted her head. "But it's strange, you seem to have your own will." "I'm not an oracle." Scarlet took a deep breath and refuted, "And I'm not one of you." No, Endesha looked at Scarlet, her eyes shining brighter and brighter. "It seems like the rewards this time are not small. Other than the little princess of the Cruz tribe, there's an unexpected reward. Who gave you the god's blood? You're just a wandering oracle." Scarlet looked at her and did not reply. It's all right, I'll find out. Andesha smiled. From now on, little girl, you are my spoils of war. Scarlet trembled. Don't even think about it. That's not up to you. Author's note. Unfortunately, I found out that there was a part missing from the copy, so I made some changes to make it complete. The extra words are a gift. Chapter 428. That's not up to you, little girl. Before Andesha finished her words, a vine shot out from behind her like a bolt of lightning. But she clearly underestimated Scarlet's strength. Even though she was tired and hungry, she nimbly flipped her body to the side and landed beside Brendel, dodging the attack. The red-haired girl with a ponytail raised her head and glared hatefully at Andesha. She knew that she was not Andesha's match when the 12 tree shepherds made their moves. Andesha was also startled. Isn't the messenger of lightning a spellcaster? She muttered to herself in surprise. A mutated bloodline? What luck. But the conceited woman did not attack again after retrieving her vine whip. Instead, she looked at Scarlet with her purplish eyes and said, You're no match for me. Come with me obediently and I won't hurt you. Scarlet did not say a word and shook her head resolutely. Teach, Andesha put down her vine whip. Humans are truly creatures that won't shed tears until they're about to die. Listen carefully, I can't guarantee that you won't be hurt. Scarlet knew that she was no match for Andesha, but she was still prepared to attack at any time. Her hands instinctively formed claws, and golden veins appeared on her arms once more. Mana reaction. Andesha raised her beautiful eyebrows and nodded lightly, but she denied the possibility. As a heretic who did evil in the chaos, the tree herders had an innate sensitivity to the flow of mana. The mysterious veins on Scarlet's body seemed to resonate with the flow of mana in the air, but there was a slight difference between them. It was more like a wizard's magic tattoo. Andesha was getting more and more curious. There were too many strange things about this little girl, and she could not wait to study her. She raised her index finger and a vine whip shot towards Scarlet. Scarlet carefully retreated, but this time the vine whip seemed to have a life of its own. It changed directions halfway and coiled around her wrist. The girl was shocked. She grabbed the vine with her left hand and tore it into pieces. What sharp claws! Andesha was slightly startled. Her vines looked soft, but they were actually corrosive. Even ordinary magic weapons would not be able to block them, but they were unable to block Scarlet's claw. However, Andesha was one of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders. When Scarlet tore away one of the vines, more vines broke out from the ground under Andesha's command. Caught off guard, the red-haired girl with a ponytail was bound tightly. At first, Scarlet tried to struggle, but Andesha used vines to bind her arms and legs tightly, rendering her immobile. Scarlet gritted her teeth and mobilized the magic in her body to attack the god's blood crystal in her heart. In Andesha's eyes, arcs of lightning appeared in the air, and the source of these arcs of lightning were all pointed at Scarlet's heart. To the oracles, such an action could only mean one thing: suicide. Most of the oracles would only do this when they were surrounded and might be captured by the enemy. This was to prevent organizations other than the tree shepherds from obtaining a sample of the blood of God. But at this moment, Scarlet was using her consciousness to attack the god's blood crystal. Even though she could not move, she still glared at Andesha with hatred. Her eyes were burning with amber flames, and there was only one meaning in them. She wanted to destroy everything. Andesha sucked in a breath of cold air. What are you doing? She looked around and tried to stop Scarlet's actions. In the next moment, Andesha's gaze finally landed on Brando, who was behind Scarlet. She immediately stretched out her hand, and a vine wrapped around the dying Brando. The sharp end of the vine was pointed at the youth's throat. Stop immediately or I'll kill him. Andesha shouted. Scarlet trembled and stopped her self-destructive actions. She gritted her teeth and looked at Andesha. She finally opened her mouth and spoke for the first time since the battle started. Despicable. Humph. Andesha heaved a sigh of relief and smiled. It's for your own good, little girl. Scarlet turned her head away. Andesha knew that if she left this youth's side, she would immediately commit suicide. She could not help but feel a little distressed. The god's blood was very precious to the tree herders, and she was also very interested in Scarlet's body. But she looked at Brando and thought to herself, I can't bring this stinky man along with me, can I? But Andesha was stunned when she looked at him. It's him? You're Brando, right? TSK, how did you end up like this? Andesha was surprised and immediately teased. Let me guess, did those cruise people do it? Scarlet turned around and looked at the woman in shock. Don't be surprised, nothing can hide from me. Andesha smiled mysteriously. There were a few wounds on Brando's body, and there was a strong aura on them that she hated. Needless to say, they were caused by the Holy Cathedral of Fire's holy spells. Scarlet was silent. Andesha tilted her head and looked at the girl, and suddenly thought of a plan. Is he your lord? Scarlet did not answer. It doesn't matter, your lord won't live for long in this state. Andesha patted her face and smiled. Mana is flowing out of his body, and for experts like us, this is no different from losing our lives. Andesha saw Scarlet's body tremble and her smile deepened. Do you intend to accompany this man until he dies? It doesn't matter, big sister can accompany you. Scarlet gritted her teeth and looked at Andesha with a serious expression. I understand. You're saying so much because you want to say that you can save Lord Brendel. I understand, if you can really do it, I'll go with you. The young girl said these words almost word by word. Smart. But remember, Scarlet stared coldly at Andesha, if my lord dies, then there's no meaning for me to live. Are you threatening me? Andesha smiled faintly. That's true love. But don't worry, if I say I'll do it, he won't die. She thought for a moment. Since I have a grudge with the Holy Cathedral of Fire, this young man can become a member of the tree herders. Andesha knew Brando because she saw him from afar when she was chasing after Vahina. Brando's display of strength against the male wolf left a deep impression on her, and she later learned of his name from Tia. He's an outstanding young man. She slowly walked over and patted Brando's face. For the sake of the Oracle of Lightning. Can you really save him? Scarlet looked at Andesha's actions and felt a little uncomfortable. But when it came to it, she began to suspect if Andesha was lying to her. With the speed of his mana loss, he'll die in an hour or two, Andesha replied, but it's easy to save him. All you need is a way to replenish the mana loss. She took in a deep breath. Diske, he didn't die on the spot with such heavy injuries. If it wasn't for the fact that I can't sense the aura of an oracle from him, I would have suspected that he's not human. But it doesn't matter, he'll be one soon. Andesha muttered to herself. What do you mean? Scarlet turned her head and glared at her. How else do you think I'm going to save him? Andesha looked at Scarlet and asked. You can't use the blood of God. Scarlet immediately understood what Andesha was going to do. She could not believe that this woman would be so crazy and immediately struggled. Stop. Andesha was not in a hurry. She took out a black crystal from her bosom and stopped. Stop? Are you sure this is the only way to save your lord, or he'll die? Scarlet was stunned and looked at Andesha in disbelief. You're lying. Why would I lie to you? Andesha replied, I'm not like those fellows from the Holy Cathedral who have the ability to revive the dead. I can save him, but this is the only way. She took out the black crystal and placed it in front of Scarlet's eyes. She looked at the little girl who was biting her lips and hesitating. In any case, I'll save him and you have to come with me. The blood of God in this crystal is a high-grade dark element. If not for you, I wouldn't be willing to use it. But Andesha was tired of talking nonsense with Scarlet. She was looking forward to seeing Brando as an oracle. Normally, the stronger the body, the more malleable it would be after becoming an oracle. However, the blood of God could not suppress the will of an expert who had passed through the elemental barrier. Among the gold-ranked experts, Brando could be said to be the best specimen she had ever seen. She ignored Scarlet's struggle and directly stabbed the crystal into Brando's heart. Brando groaned softly and frowned in his unconscious state. No! Scarlet screamed and widened her eyes. Andesha clapped her hands and turned her head. You don't have to be so nervous. You're not the only one who used your will to suppress the blood of God. I think your Sir Lord might succeed, so don't be in a hurry to commit suicide, little fellow. Who knows, you might accidentally be separated from your Sir Lord forever. Although Andesha said those words, she did not believe them in her heart. The blood of darkness in her hand was different from the blood of the thunder god. It was the blood of the highest god. Even an expert who had awakened his elemental barrier would not dare to say that he had 100% confidence in suppressing such a blood of God. But Scarlet glared fiercely at Andesha. Andesha's words gave her a glimmer of hope. She turned to look at Brando. The blood of God in the black crystal had begun to spread throughout the young lord's body. She bit her lips and prayed that a miracle would happen. At this time, Andesha suddenly turned around. She suddenly felt the black crystal in her hand vibrate, and a golden thread seeped into the crystal from Brando's body. Then a second thread, a third thread, and more golden threads merged into the crystal, causing it to shine with a golden light. This? Andesha looked at all of this with her mouth agape. She had witnessed the birth of countless divine envoys, but she had never seen such a scene. She immediately realized that something was wrong. She subconsciously wanted to pull the crystal out, but just as her hand touched the crystal, she could not help but scream. Andesha could feel her hand burning and she quickly pulled it back. She had only touched it lightly, but she realized that her hand was completely burnt. What's going on? Andesha looked at the crystal in Brando's chest in disbelief. The crystal was trembling and emitting a dazzling golden light in all directions. The golden light was getting brighter and brighter, and almost half of the valley was illuminated. At this moment, a cold voice rang in his mind while he was still in a daze. System notification: blood of origin has been matched. The restoration process has begun. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.